Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I've been camping in these woods before, more times than I can count. I've always found peace in the isolation, miles away from the constant hum of civilization. There's something about the endless sea of trees, the way the forest holds its breath as if it's keeping secrets, that has always drawn me in. But this time something feels off. And now, sitting here in the flickering light of the dying campfire, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. It started small, of course, things like this always do. Rustling in the trees, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder but quickly dismiss. Animals, I'd told myself. The forest is full of life. You learn to expect it. But that night, the air was heavier, oppressive, like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The rustling became more persistent, and I swore I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching dead leaves underfoot in a rhythm that didn't match the wind. I was camping with my buddy Derek. The plan had been simple. 2 nights in the backcountry, just us and nature. We set up camp by a small clearing, nestled deep in the woods where no trails reached. By sunset, we were roasting hot dogs over the fire, laughing about old stories. But as darkness swallowed the last bit of light, the forest around us changed. Derek was the first to comment. "You hear that?" he asked, his face illuminated in the orange glow of the flames, eyes darting toward the trees. I nodded, listening. The sound was faint, like distant whispering. I tried to brush it off, but there was an edge to it, something unnatural. It wasn't until we both went quiet, straining to listen, that I heard it, something far off but unmistakable. A howl, long and guttural, nothing like I'd ever heard before. It echoed through the forest, and for the first time in my life I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "That didn't sound like a coyote," Derek muttered, standing up and grabbing his flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness but revealed nothing but the dense wall of trees surrounding us. "Probably just a wolf," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, they felt like a lie. The howl was different. There was something wrong about it. It felt too close, too aware of us. The rest of the night passed uneasily. The fire burned low, and we sat in silence, every snap of a branch, every shift of the wind making me jump. I could feel my skin prickling, the back of my neck crawling like I was being stared at from the shadows beyond the fire's reach. At some point we must have fallen asleep, but it was restless. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something heavy moving just outside the tent. It was close, breathing, deep, rattling breaths, like whatever it was savoring the scent of us. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. I lay still, terrified, barely breathing. I didn't dare move. I just listened. The sound of footsteps circled our camp, slow and deliberate. Every step seemed to echo inside my skull. Then they stopped, right at the entrance to the tent. There was a long pause, and then I heard it, a low growl. It reverberated through my chest, deep and unnatural. It was close, so close that I could hear the saliva dripping from its maw. I gripped the zipper of the tent, holding it closed, my knuckles white. Derek stirred beside me, whispering, "What is that?" I couldn't answer him. I didn't know. All I knew was that we were not alone, and whatever was out there wasn't human. The growling stopped, and for a long moment there was silence. Then the footsteps resumed, retreating back into the woods, disappearing into the night. Neither of us slept after that. We sat in the tent, listening to the silence, hearts pounding, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, we emerged cautiously. The forest seemed eerily quiet, as though it too was holding its breath. But then we saw the tracks, huge clawed footprints in the soft earth around the tent. They were too large to belong to any animal native to these woods. The strange thing was, The tracks were scattered, almost like they had been stalking us in a wide circle, taunting us. "We need to get out of here," Derek said, his voice trembling. I agreed, and we quickly packed up camp, eager to leave whatever had prowled around us in the night behind. But the forest wasn't done with us yet. As we made our way back down the trail, the feeling of being watched intensified. The air grew colder, unnaturally so. And then I heard it again, the whispering. Only this time it was clearer, more defined. It was a voice garbled and distorted, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite manage. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the tree line, standing just far enough away to be cloaked in shadow, was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, with long, twisted limbs and glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. It stood there, watching us, unmoving. The air around it seemed to ripple like heat rising off pavement, warping its form. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I gasped, grabbing Derek's arm. But he just stared at me, confused, like he hadn't seen anything. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his face pale but his eyes wide with fear. I opened my mouth to explain, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Derek's shadow. It wasn't his. It was longer, more twisted, like the thing I had just seen. And then I heard it. That same distorted voice coming from his direction, whispering my name. I stepped back, heart racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But when I looked at Derek again, his eyes, they weren't his. They glowed, just like the creatures from before. I stumbled backward, running, tearing through the forest without looking back. The sound of footsteps followed, but I didn't dare stop. I ran until I could see the sun breaking through the trees, the sight of the parking lot like a beacon of salvation. But I wasn't alone. I can still feel it. Something is out there, watching me. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I hear that voice. Whispers calling my name from the dark, telling me it's only a matter of time. I don't know if Derek ever made it out, or if what came back with me was really him, or something else entirely. I've always considered myself an experienced camper. Years of navigating forests, setting up campsites, and sleeping under the stars had given me a certain confidence. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened last weekend. A few buddies and I had planned a trip to Black Hollow Woods, a stretch of wilderness far from civilization. It was dense, remote, and perfect for a weekend of getting away from it all. But, as fate would have it, all my friends bailed at the last minute. Work, family commitments, you name it. I didn't want to cancel the trip, so I decided to go alone. It wasn't the first time I'd camped solo, and something about the isolation excited me. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon, my pack heavy with gear. The sun was already sinking, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The trees in Black Hollow Woods were massive, their thick trunks giving the place a claustrophobic feel. I hiked for about 3 hours, pushing deeper into the woods until the trail became almost non-existent. That's where I set up camp, right in the heart of nowhere. As dusk turned to night, the sounds of the forest became more pronounced. The hooting of distant owls, the rustle of leaves as small creatures scurried about. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow around my tent. It was peaceful at first. About an hour after nightfall, I heard it. A howl. It cut through the night, long and haunting, somewhere deep in the woods. I've heard wolves before, but this was different. It wasn't quite animal, but not human either. It didn't sound right. It was too deliberate, too measured, like it was meant for something. My heart skipped a beat as I sat there, staring into the dark trees. Another howl echoed, closer this time. I told myself it was just a wolf. Wolves weren't common in these parts, but not impossible. Still, there was something unnerving about it, something that made me feel like I wasn't alone out here. I stoked the fire, trying to shake off the chill crawling up my spine. That's when I noticed the silence. The usual forest sounds, the rustling, the chirping of insects, had all stopped. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the woods were holding their breath. I sat still, listening, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But then, just beyond the reach of the firelight, I saw movement. At first it was a shadow, just a flicker, something I could have easily written off as a trick of the light. But then it moved again, too fast, darting between the trees. I squinted into the darkness, but whatever it was had already disappeared into the shadows. That was enough for me. I doused the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a deer or some other harmless animal. But that didn't stop the uneasy feeling gnawing at my gut. I lay there listening. Minutes passed, maybe an hour, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying that howl, the way it echoed unnaturally through the trees. And then, the sound of footsteps. Not the quiet, shuffling steps of an animal, but slow, deliberate footsteps like someone walking around the perimeter of my camp. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The steps circled the tent, closer and closer. They were too heavy to be any kind of animal I'd encountered in these woods. I reached for the knife in my pack, gripping it tightly as I waited. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear breathing. Slow, deep breaths, almost as if whatever was out there was smelling the air, searching for something. The tent walls rustled slightly, as though someone, or something, was brushing against them. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I couldn't. Then, without warning, the zipper on my tent began to move, slowly, carefully, like someone was testing it, seeing if I was still inside. My blood ran cold. I gripped the knife tighter, waiting for whatever was out there to come inside. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the zipper stopped. The footsteps moved away, retreating into the darkness. I lay there, shaking, listening to the sound fade into the distance. It was gone. But something told me it wasn't far. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my knife, my eyes wide open, staring at the tent flap. When dawn finally broke, I wasted no time. I packed up my gear as fast as I could and started the hike back to my car. The forest felt different in the daylight, less menacing, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead that I saw him. A park ranger standing by the entrance, his back to me. I hadn't seen any other cars on the way in, so I was surprised to see someone out here this early. I called out to him, relieved to see another person after that terrifying night. "Hey, good morning," I said, trying to sound casual. The ranger didn't respond. He just stood there, his back still facing me, his body unnaturally still. Something about him seemed off. I stepped closer, about to speak again, when he slowly turned around. My blood froze. His face was pale, almost sickly, his eyes wide and empty. But it wasn't his face that terrified me. It was the fact that his mouth was open, hanging in a twisted, unnatural grin, and from it came that same low, haunting howl I had heard the night before. I stumbled back, heart racing, and without thinking, I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, practically throwing myself inside and speeding off. I didn't look back once. It's been 3 days since I left Black Hollow Woods, and I still can't shake the feeling that I didn't come back alone. Every night, just as I'm about to fall asleep, I hear it, that same howl, soft at first, but growing louder. And then, the footsteps, circling my house. Whatever was in those woods followed me, and now it's waiting. The fire crackled softly in front of me, casting flickering shadows against the trees that surrounded our campsite. The dense forest seemed to close in around us, dark and ancient. My 2 friends, Greg and Sarah, sat across from me, their faces illuminated in the warm glow, but beyond that ring of light, just blackness. We had decided to take a weekend camping trip deep in the woods, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of the city. This place, nestled in the far reaches of the national park, was perfect. No cell service, no noise except for the occasional owl or rustling of leaves in the wind. As the night crept on, the forest seemed to grow eerily still. Even the wind had died down. Sarah had already turned in, curling up inside her tent, leaving Greg and me to finish off the last of our beers. I stared into the fire, feeling a strange sense of unease settling in my gut. "Did you hear that?" Greg suddenly asked, breaking the silence. I paused, listening intently. For a moment all was quiet. Then, there it was, a faint, distant sound, like crying. Soft, but unmistakable. I frowned. "Could be an animal." Greg shook his head. "No, it sounds like a person." A chill ran down my spine as I strained to listen again. The crying was faint, almost drowned by the crackling fire, but it was there, coming from deeper in the woods. A child, maybe? Or a woman? "I don't like this," I muttered. Greg stood up, peering into the thick trees. "What if someone's lost out there? We should go check." I wasn't thrilled about the idea of wandering into the dark, but the thought of someone in trouble gnawed at me. Reluctantly, I grabbed my flashlight and we set off, leaving the warm glow of the fire behind. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the crying grew louder, more distinct. It was definitely a woman, or at least, it sounded like one. The beam of my flashlight cut through the thick trees, casting eerie shapes on the trunks. The farther we walked, the more the sense of isolation gnawed at me. The darkness felt alive somehow, pressing in from all sides. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Greg was a few steps ahead of me when he suddenly stopped. His body went rigid. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing. I followed his gaze. At the edge of my flashlight's reach, just beyond the trees, I saw her. A figure, pale and thin, standing perfectly still among the shadows. She was turned away from us, but her long hair hung down, matted and wet, and her arms dangled lifelessly at her sides. "Hey!" Greg called out, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "Are you all right?" The woman didn't move, didn't respond. She just stood there, her back to us, crying softly. Something was wrong. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but Greg was already moving closer, concern overriding his fear. As he stepped forward, the crying stopped, completely. The silence that followed was suffocating. Greg froze, inches away from her now. Slowly, the woman's head began to turn, too slowly, too unnaturally, like a glitch in a video. And then, she smiled. Her mouth stretched impossibly wide, far beyond what any human mouth should. Her skin rippled, almost like it was shifting, and that's when I saw it. Her eyes, hollow and black, stared into mine, not with sadness, but with hunger. My breath caught in my throat. Greg took a step back, stumbling. We need to go," he stammered, but it was too late. She moved faster than I could have ever imagined. One moment she was standing still, the next she was right in front of Greg, her twisted face inches from his. But it wasn't a woman anymore. The skin was sagging, peeling, revealing something dark and skeletal underneath. Greg screamed. He tried to run, but her long, clawed fingers wrapped around his neck, lifting him off the ground like he weighed nothing. I stumbled back, heart racing, terror freezing me in place. I wanted to help, to do something, but I couldn't move. I couldn't think. And then she spoke. Only it wasn't her voice. It was Greg's. "Help me," she whispered, mimicking his exact tone, his exact fear. "Please." The sound of it, Greg's voice coming from that thing, snapped me out of my paralysis. I turned and ran. I didn't look back, even as I heard Greg's cries echoing through the trees. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I collapsed near the campsite, gasping for breath. The fire had died down to embers, the only light in the encroaching darkness. Suddenly, a figure appeared from the shadows, a man wearing the uniform of a park ranger. Relief flooded me. "Thank God," I gasped. "You have to help. Something got Greg." The ranger's face was hidden in shadow, but I could see his eyes glinting in the low light. "You're lucky," he said in a low, calm voice. "Not many make it out after seeing one of those." I nodded frantically. "What was it?" He stepped closer, his boots silent on the forest floor. "Skinwalker," he said, his voice strangely flat. takes the form of what it kills, mimics its victims. I shuddered, every hair on my body standing on end. We need to go back. We need to... He raised a hand, silencing me. Don't worry about Greg. I blinked, confused. What do you mean? The ranger smiled then, a slow, unsettling grin. He's already here. And with that, the ranger's face began to change, his skin rippled and contorted, melting away to reveal something all too familiar, the wide, inhuman smile of the creature I had just run from. The last thing I heard was my own voice, laughing. The woods were always a place of comfort for me, an escape from the hectic demands of daily life. Growing up, I spent countless weekends camping with my family, so when I decided to take a solo trip to clear my head, it didn't seem like a big deal. I knew the routine: pack light, bring plenty of water, and always respect the wilderness. This time, I chose a spot deep in a national forest, far from any marked trails, somewhere I could get truly lost in nature. It was late October, the air crisp, with the trees shedding the last of their red and gold leaves. I found a secluded clearing near a small stream and set up camp. There was no cell signal out here, but that was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, time to think, and nothing but the forest to keep me company. For the first day, it was perfect. I hiked around, gathered firewood, and spent the evening by the campfire, listening to the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional call of an owl. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a strange sensation settled over me. It was subtle, like a shift in the atmosphere, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. I brushed it off as the typical unease that comes with being alone in the wilderness. After all, it's easy to get spooked when it's just you in the dark. But that night, as I lay in my tent, something wasn't right. At first it was small noises, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, the normal sounds of the forest at night. But they seemed closer, too close, like something was moving just outside the tent. I grabbed my flashlight, heart thudding in my chest, and shined it through the thin fabric. Nothing. Just shadows. I closed my eyes and tried to fall asleep, telling myself it was just an animal passing through. But then, at around 3 a.m., I heard it, a low, shuffling sound right by my head, like something or someone was circling the tent, slow, deliberate steps crunching through the fallen leaves. It wasn't the skittish movements of a deer or the quick scurrying of a raccoon. This was something heavy, purposeful. I held my breath, gripping my flashlight tightly. I was certain if I made any noise, whatever was out there would hear me. The steps stopped right outside the entrance of the tent. I could hear breathing now, slow and raspy, almost like someone struggling to suck in air through damaged lungs. My heart pounded in my ears, louder than the forest around me. Then something tugged at the tent, just a light pull on one of the zippers, barely enough to move it, but enough to know that whatever was out there wasn't just curious. It was trying to get in. I sat there frozen, too terrified to move, trying to think of what to do. I hadn't brought a weapon. I never felt the need for one out here. I was miles from civilization, and the closest thing I had to protection was the dull camp knife in my backpack. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A person? But something in my gut told me that this was neither. And then it spoke. Not in words, not really, but in a low, guttural growl that almost formed the sound of a voice. It was as if the forest itself had learned to speak, a twisted, unnatural mimicry of human speech. The sound sent chills down my spine. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it felt right. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. The thing outside circled the tent again, slowly, its steps dragging in the dirt, until it stopped at the back where the fabric was stretched thin. The tent wall sagged slightly as if something pressed against it from the other side. I could make out the vague outline of a figure, tall, impossibly thin, with arms that hung too long at its sides, almost dragging on the ground. It crouched low, its face now mere inches from where I was lying. I could feel it, not just physically but in my mind. A presence, ancient and malevolent, something that had been here long before humans ever walked these woods. It whispered again, this time closer to language but distorted, garbled. "Come, out!" It rasped, the words twisting in the air like they didn't belong to any living thing. My breath caught in my throat, my muscles locked in fear. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. For what felt like hours, it stayed there, crouched outside the tent as if waiting for me to answer. Then, without warning, the presence lifted. I heard it retreat, the slow, shuffling footsteps fading into the distance. The air in the tent was thick, suffocating, but I didn't move, afraid that if I did, it would come back. At dawn, I finally found the courage to unzip the tent and step outside. The clearing was bathed in cold, pale light, but there were no signs of anything unusual. No tracks, no disturbed foliage. It was as if the thing had never been there at all. But I knew better. The feeling of being watched hadn't left. The woods still felt hostile, like they were keeping something hidden, something just beyond my sight. I packed up in record time, not caring about breakfast or even the fire I had let die out. I needed to get out. The hike back to the trailhead took most of the day, and the entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, staying just out of sight, moving when I wasn't looking. As I reached the trailhead and finally stepped onto the dirt road that would lead me back to civilization, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The forest behind me seemed to breathe a collective sigh, as if it had let me go, for now. But I couldn't forget what I'd heard. That voice, those words. A few weeks later, I did some research on the area, just to try and make sense of it. I found old stories, local legends passed down by the indigenous people of the region. They spoke of the Wendigo, a creature born of the forest, a twisted spirit that mimics human voices to lure its victims deeper into the wilderness. They said it was always hungry, always hunting. I haven't gone camping since, and sometimes late at night I hear it again, that raspy voice, faint but clear, whispering just outside my window. "Come, out." I've been camping all my life. There's nothing like the peace of the deep woods, the stillness that settles over the trees when the sun dips below the horizon, and the crackle of the fire cutting through the cold night air. But this last trip, this one changed everything. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. My best friend Matt and I had been planning it for weeks. We both needed a break from our jobs, our lives, and the constant buzz of the city. We picked a secluded spot deep in the Appalachian woods, miles from the nearest town. A place where we could just disconnect. The first day was perfect. We hiked for hours, set up our tent near a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, and cracked open a couple of beers as the fire crackled beneath a brilliant sky. It was peaceful, serene even. But as the night crept in, that stillness I loved so much began to feel heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. It started with the sounds. At first I brushed it off as the usual forest noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. You hear that kind of stuff all the time out there. But this was different. The sounds weren't random, like animals scurrying in the underbrush. They were rhythmic, almost deliberate. Matt noticed it too. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Probably just deer or something," I replied, trying to convince myself more than him. But deep down, I knew something was off. The sounds continued, getting closer. There was a weird cadence to it, like footsteps, slow, purposeful steps that stopped the moment we stopped talking. Every time we shined our flashlights into the woods, we saw nothing but trees, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. By midnight, the noises had stopped, leaving the woods in an unnatural silence. No crickets, no wind, just the crackling of the fire. Matt, trying to lighten the mood, joked about Bigfoot, but neither of us laughed. We turned in for the night, but sleep didn't come easy. The air inside the tent felt suffocating, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt that same sensation, that we were being watched. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of Matt unzipping the tent. "What are you doing?" I mumbled, still half asleep. "Just gotta take a leak," he whispered back, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the moon. I heard him step outside and figured I'd try to go back to sleep. But minutes passed, and he didn't return. I sat up, listening. The forest was still eerily quiet, but I could hear faint noises, twigs snapping, the same deliberate footsteps from before. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air. "Matt?" I called, shining the beam around the clearing. Nothing. My heart started pounding in my chest. The fire had died down to embers, casting long, eerie shadows around the camp. That's when I saw him. Matt stood at the edge of the clearing just beyond the reach of the dying firelight. His back was to me, shoulders stiff and hunched, staring into the woods. "Hey man, you good?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't move. Something about the way he was standing sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't right. His posture was wrong. Like he was too rigid, too stiff. I stopped a few feet away, my breath clouding in the cold air. "Matt," I whispered. Slowly, he turned around. But it wasn't Matt. Not really. His face, it looked like him, sure, but the eyes were wrong. They were too wide, too dark. His mouth twitched like he was trying to smile but didn't quite know how. It was like someone was wearing his skin, pretending to be him, but didn't know how to act human. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, without a word, he, or it, turned and walked back into the woods. Not hurriedly, just slow, deliberate steps, like it knew I was too terrified to follow. I didn't. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the spot where it disappeared. My body felt like it had been drained of all warmth, all strength. Finally, I forced myself to move, stumbling back to the tent. I didn't sleep, I just sat there clutching the flashlight, waiting for morning. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I ventured out, calling Matt's name over and over. There was no answer, no sign of him. It was like he had vanished. I spent hours searching the woods, but it was useless. The strange thing was, the deeper I went into the forest, the more I found signs of movement. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, but no Matt. Just tracks, and not just his. The footprints were wrong, too large, too misshapen. They were human-like, but distorted, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them didn't quite know how feet were supposed to work. I was ready to head back to camp, to pack up and hike out when I heard it. Matt's voice. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was him, calling my name. Relief washed over me, and I ran toward the sound. But as I got closer, that feeling of wrongness returned, stronger than ever. His voice was coming from deeper in the woods, much deeper than he could have gone in the time he'd been missing, and there was something off about the tone. It was too calm, too steady. I stopped in my tracks. That's when I noticed something else. The forest was completely silent again. No birds, no insects, nothing. "Come on, man," the voice called again. "I'm over here." I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the car, legs burning, chest heaving. I didn't look back. I just drove. Fast. It's been weeks since that night, and Matt still hasn't been found. Search parties turned up, nothing. No trace of him. It's like he vanished into thin air. But sometimes late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I hear it. His voice, calling my name from just outside my window, but it's not him, and I know better than to answer. I've always been drawn to the woods. Something about the isolation, the serenity, the quiet calls to me like nothing else. So, when I heard about a camping spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far off the beaten path and rarely visited, I couldn't resist. It was the kind of trip I craved, remote, untouched, and full of mystery. I planned everything carefully, packing for a 3-day solo excursion. The trek itself took the better part of a day, and by the time I reached the campsite, the sun was already beginning to sink behind the trees. The forest was dense here, the kind where the canopy is so thick it swallows the sky. It was dark, but I welcomed it. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and settled in for what I thought would be a peaceful night. It wasn't long before I realized something was off. As dusk turned to night, I noticed how deathly quiet the forest had become. No crickets chirping, no distant hoot of an owl. Just silence. It was unnerving, but I chalked it up to the thickness of the forest, muting the sounds of wildlife. I had just convinced myself it was nothing when I heard something faint in the distance. A low, guttural growl. I froze. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. Too deep. Too unnatural. The fire crackled beside me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the tree line. The growl came again, closer this time, vibrating through the ground beneath me. My skin prickled, a cold wave of fear washing over me. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark, but there was nothing. Only trees. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just a bear. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But even then, something felt wrong, like the woods themselves were watching. I didn't sleep much that night, every creak and snap from the forest sending my heart racing. But nothing happened. Not until the second night. I'd spent most of the day hiking, trying to clear my head and shake the paranoia that had settled in my bones. But as the day stretched on, I couldn't help but feel like I was being followed. Every now and then I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting between the trees, gone the moment I turned my head. It was subtle, like whatever it was didn't want to be seen. But it was there. I knew it was there. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the ground. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost suffocating. I tried to ignore it, to focus on starting the fire and calming my nerves. But then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods just beyond the reach of my firelight. At first I thought it was a person, a hiker maybe, or a ranger, but something about the way it stood, motionless and hunched, set off alarms in my head. I shone my flashlight toward it, and that's when I saw the eyes, yellow, glowing, and far too large for any human. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped closer, revealing more of itself. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its body twisted and elongated, like a man stretched beyond human limits. Its skin was a mottled, sickly gray, and its face was all wrong. It was as if someone had tried to sculpt a human face but got everything just slightly off. Too wide, too sharp. The mouth too wide, and filled with rows of jagged teeth. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The thing didn't move. It just stood there staring at me with those horrible yellow eyes. Its mouth curled into a grin that looked more like a snarl. I don't know how long I stood frozen in fear, but eventually the thing turned and slunk back into the trees, its movements disturbingly smooth and silent, like it was gliding. I wanted to run, to pack up and leave right then and there, but the forest was pitch black, and the thought of running blind through the woods while that thing was out there made my stomach churn. So I stayed by the fire, clutching my flashlight, barely breathing. I didn't sleep at all that night, and that's when I heard them. Voices, faint at first, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. They were coming from deeper in the woods, too far for me to make out the words. But as they grew louder, I realized something horrifying. They were mimicking my voice, my own voice, repeating phrases I had said earlier that day. "This is going to be a great trip," it said, followed by a garbled, distorted laugh. Then another voice joined in, this one raspier, more guttural, repeating another phrase I had spoken. "The view from here is unreal." I felt sick. Whatever was out there, it had been watching me, listening to me, and now it was mocking me. The voices circled my camp, growing louder, more frantic. It sounded like there were dozens of them, all talking at once, all using my voice, overlapping and twisting until it was a cacophony of distorted sound. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head, reverberating through my skull. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag and bolted, abandoning my tent and gear, running blindly through the woods, the voices following me, laughing, repeating my words over and over. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I saw the faint glow of a lantern through the trees. A ranger's station. Relief flooded through me, and I sprinted toward it, pounding on the door until a man opened it, a park ranger, older, with a weathered face and tired eyes. I stumbled inside, gasping out what had happened. The ranger listened, his expression grim, but he didn't seem surprised. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said, "You're lucky you made it out." "Made it out of what?" I asked, my voice trembling. He sighed and glanced out the window, his eyes scanning the dark tree line. "There are things in these woods, things that aren't natural. They mimic what they hear, take shapes you might recognize. But they're not human, and they're not friendly." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. What do they want?" The ranger didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the door and locked it, his face pale as he whispered, "We're not alone." And then from just outside the cabin I heard it again. My voice, "Let me in." I've been a park ranger for nearly 7 years, stationed in the dense heart of the Pacific Northwest. The forest here is ancient, full of towering trees, some older than time itself. It's a beautiful, serene place during the day, silent except for the gentle rustle of the wind through the pines and the distant calls of wildlife. At night, though, the woods take on a different character. You begin to notice things that don't make sense. I used to dismiss them, brush off the strange sensations as tricks of the mind. But not anymore. It was late October when things started happening. I was assigned to a solo patrol out near Black Hollow, a section of the forest known for its jagged cliffs and tangled undergrowth. Not many campers venture out there, too remote, too easy to get lost. Still, the occasional thrill-seeker or backcountry hiker would make the trek, and it was my job to make sure they stayed safe. I set out just before dusk, my truck bouncing over the uneven trail. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the ground. The further I drove, the more oppressive the forest felt, as if it were closing in around me. Eventually, the road became impassable, and I parked near a clearing, deciding to hike the rest of the way to a fire lookout about 2 miles deeper into the woods. As I hiked, the temperature began to drop, and the usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, rustling leaves, faded into an eerie silence. That's when I first noticed it, the feeling of being watched. I've spent countless nights alone in the woods, but this was different. This wasn't the vague paranoia of isolation. This was something specific, targeted. I stopped scanning the trees, half expecting to see a cougar or a bear, but there was nothing, just the stillness. I shook it off and pressed on. About an hour into the hike, I reached a narrow creek, the water trickling quietly over the rocks. That's when I saw the first sign something was wrong. Across the creek, maybe 20 feet away, stood a deer. At least I thought it was a deer. Its body was wrong, legs too long, unnaturally thin. Its head was lowered as if grazing, but its eyes were fixed on me. I stood frozen, staring back at it. Something about the creature made my skin crawl. Slowly, without turning its head, it began to back away, retreating into the trees. And just like that, it was gone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I was already too far in, too committed. I pushed forward, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe the shadows had distorted its shape. I told myself 1,000 lies, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. As I neared the lookout, the wind began to pick up, howling through the trees in mournful gusts. The structure stood atop a rocky outcrop, offering a panoramic view of the forest below. I climbed the creaky ladder to the top, trying to shake the unease that had settled deep in my gut. Once inside, I checked the radio, but there was no signal. Figures. These old towers were notoriously unreliable. The sun had fully set by now, and darkness swallowed the landscape. I turned on my flashlight, scanning the tree line below. Everything looked still, normal. But that feeling, the one that had followed me since the creek, had only grown stronger. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, watching, waiting for something. Suddenly a movement caught my eye. I focused the beam of my flashlight on the ground below the tower. At first I thought it was just a deer again, but this time there was no mistaking it. A figure was standing there just outside the reach of the light, human-like but not human. Its limbs were elongated, its posture hunched, and its skin, pale, stretched tight over two thin bones. I blinked, convinced I was seeing things, but it didn't move. It just stood there, staring up at me. My heart pounded in my chest. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was some kind of animal, maybe. But no, I knew what I was looking at. This was no animal. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I grabbed the radio again, but the static was louder now, almost deafening. I turned it off, feeling a rising sense of panic. I needed to leave. Now. I bolted down the ladder, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure was gone, but the forest felt wrong. The trees seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting unnaturally. I sprinted back the way I'd come, my footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness. Then I heard it, a low guttural growl close behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran, faster than I'd ever run before, the cold air burning in my lungs. But no matter how fast I went, the growling grew louder, closer, until I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. Finally, I broke through the tree line, stumbling into the clearing where I'd left my truck. I fumbled with the keys, barely able to breathe, before finally getting the door open. I jumped inside, slamming it shut and locking the doors. The forest was deathly quiet again. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Slowly I dared to glance in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me, just the trees, swaying gently in the wind. I let out a shaky breath and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced back at the lookout one last time, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing on the roof of the tower, watching me. It was the same figure from before, pale and thin, but this time it was smiling. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I floored it, not daring to look back again. To this day, I don't know what I saw out there in Black Hollow, but I haven't been back since. I filled my report, left out the details, and transferred to another post far from those woods. I can still feel them watching sometimes, though, late at night. I'll be sitting in my cabin, alone, and the wind will start to howl. And I'll know they're out there waiting. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a peaceful break from the chaos of our city lives. Me, Mark, Sarah, and Tyler had been talking for weeks about getting away, escaping to the remote solitude of Deer Haven Forest. None of us had been there before, but that was part of the appeal, an untouched expanse of wilderness, miles away from any town or even cell service. We arrived just before dusk, parking the car at the edge of a narrow dirt path that wound deeper into the woods. The forest stretched out before us, dense and foreboding, but beautiful. The tall pine trees seemed to go on forever, their tops swaying gently in the breeze. There was a strange stillness to the air, but we didn't think much of it. This was exactly what we had come for, after all. Quiet isolation. As we hiked in, setting up camp a few miles into the forest, the sun began to sink low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. Sarah, always the most practical one, had insisted we get a fire going early. By the time the stars were twinkling above us, we were settled in, enjoying the warmth of the flames and the cool night air. "Did you hear that?" Tyler asked suddenly, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. His head was tilted slightly, like he was trying to catch something just out of earshot. We all paused, listening. There it was, faint, almost too quiet to notice, a soft, melodic whistling drifting through the trees. It didn't sound like birds or wind, more like someone whistling a tune. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. This forest was supposed to be empty. No one else was supposed to be out here. "It's probably just the wind," Sarah said, though her voice was a little tight. Mark chuckled, tossing another log into the fire. "Yeah, or Bigfoot practicing his scales. Relax. We're in the middle of nowhere." But as the night wore on, the whistling didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, clearer. It seemed to move, sometimes coming from deeper in the woods, sometimes from closer, as if circling us. We all noticed it, but no one wanted to admit that it was starting to unnerve us. We distracted ourselves with jokes and ghost stories, though I could tell the others were growing more uneasy with each passing minute. Finally, I stood up. "I'm going to check it out. Probably some animal or something. I'll be back in a minute." "Be careful," Sarah warned, though she tried to sound casual. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped away from the fire, walking toward the trees where the whistling seemed to come from. The moment I left the circle of light, the forest felt different. The darkness was thick, oppressive, and the sound of my own footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. The whistling was clearer now, like it was just ahead of me. I followed the sound deeper into the woods, weaving between the trees, shining my flashlight around, but I saw nothing. No animals, no people, just the trees and the darkness. But that whistling, it didn't stop, and worse, it began to change. At first it was a simple, repetitive tune, like someone mindlessly whistling a song they couldn't quite remember. But now it was discordant, irregular, almost mocking. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as the sound seemed to move all around me, like whoever or whatever was whistling was circling me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding weak in the vast empty woods. "Is someone out there?" No answer, just more whistling. Only now it was closer. I took a step back, heart pounding in my chest, and turned to head back to camp. That's when I saw it, just for a moment in the beam of my flashlight, a figure standing between the trees, maybe 20 feet away. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long for its body. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel it staring at me, even from that distance. And then it whistled. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped closer, slow and deliberate. The whistling never stopped, but the tune became distorted, garbled, like it wasn't coming from human lips. I didn't wait any longer. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, my flashlight bouncing wildly in the dark. I could hear the whistling behind me, growing louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. The trees seemed to close in around me, the forest an endless maze of shadows and branches. Finally, I burst back into the clearing where we had set up camp. I was breathless, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I reached the fire, everything looked wrong. Mark, Sarah, and Tyler were still sitting by the fire, but they were motionless. Too still. The flames crackled in front of them, but they didn't react. Didn't even seem to notice I had returned. A cold dread settled over me as I approached them. "Guys?" I whispered, stepping closer. No response. I reached out to shake Sarah's shoulder, and the moment I touched her, her body slumped forward. Limp. Like a puppet with its strings cut. I stumbled back in horror, my flashlight dropping to the ground, the beam flickering out. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared at their lifeless bodies, still sitting upright, their faces slack, eyes empty. And then, the whistling started again, right behind me. I spun around, my heart stopping as I saw it, standing at the edge of the firelight, the figure from the woods. Its face was no longer hidden. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin, wider than any human's could be from ear to ear. Its lips puckered as it whistled that same twisted tune. My legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place as the thing stepped forward, its long limbs bending unnaturally, its grin widening impossibly. It tilted its head almost playfully as it reached out toward me with long skeletal fingers. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of that horrible, mocking whistle. When I woke up, I was alone. The fire was cold, the tents were gone, and my friends, Mark, Sarah, Tyler, were nowhere to be found. There was no trace of them, no sign that anyone had ever been here at all. Except for the whistling, it never stops. I've been camping all my life. I love the isolation, the crisp air, the sense of detachment from the world. You set up camp, share a few beers around the fire, and let the night's peaceful stillness wash over you. But this time, it was different. It was a cool October weekend, and my friends and I had decided to hike deep into Pine Ridge Forest. It's remote, sure, but that's what we loved about it. Untouched, serene. The only access road was long and winding, and we hadn't seen another car for miles. We arrived at our campsite just before sunset. The tall pines loomed above us, their silhouettes against the fading light making the forest feel ancient, like it had been here long before any of us. After setting up our tents, we started a fire, cracking jokes and passing around a flask. Typical stuff. But as the sky turned a deep indigo, something felt off. It started with the sounds, low, distant howls carried on the wind. Not wolves, not coyotes, something else. Something I couldn't quite place. The others didn't seem to notice at first, but I did. And once I pointed it out, everyone fell quiet, listening. There it was again, closer this time. A deep guttural groan like an animal in pain. But there was something unnatural about it. My friend Dave brushed it off, claiming it was just the wind, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We tried to ignore it, laughing nervously and turning our focus back to the fire. That's when we saw him, the park ranger. He stood just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the flickering light of the fire. Tall, broad shoulders, his ranger hat low over his face. There hadn't been a ranger station anywhere near the trail, but we assumed he was just out on patrol. "Hey there," Dave called out. "You need something?" The ranger didn't respond. He just stood there motionless, staring. At least, I think he was staring. The shadow cast by his hat made it hard to tell. We waited, but still nothing. The fire crackled and popped, and the silence between us grew thicker, heavier. My pulse quickened, a primal instinct kicking in, telling me something wasn't right. After what felt like an eternity, the ranger finally moved, slowly, deliberately. He stepped back into the darkness, vanishing into the trees without a word. My friends laughed it off again, trying to break the tension, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The howls came back, louder now, and they seemed to echo from all around us. It wasn't just one sound anymore. It was several. They moved unnervingly fast through the woods, sometimes too far away to pinpoint, other times so close it felt like they were just beyond the tree line. The firelight flickered wildly, casting twisted shadows that danced and slithered across the ground. That's when we saw it again, the ranger. This time he was closer, just beyond the edge of the fire's glow. But something was different. His hat was gone. His head tilted unnaturally to the side, like he was trying to look at us from an angle that no human should be able to achieve. And then, the smell hit us. The stench of rotting meat, thick and sour. It was overwhelming, and I felt my stomach churn. I glanced at my friends. Their faces were pale, eyes wide. This wasn't a game anymore. "Let's get inside the tents," I whispered, but no one moved. The ranger, or whatever it was, took another step forward, and I saw it. His legs. They weren't right. They bent backward like a deer's. I could barely breathe as the realization hit me. This wasn't a man. It wasn't a ranger. Suddenly Dave stood up. "Hey, what the hell do you want?" His voice shook, but he tried to sound brave. The thing paused, its head snapping back in a grotesque motion. like it had just noticed him for the first time. Slowly it lifted a hand, a long, distorted hand that stretched into claws, and pointed. It was pointing at Dave. Without warning, the howls returned, deafening this time, filling the forest with a cacophony of screams. And then the thing smiled. It smiled in a way that no human could ever smile, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. That's when we ran. We sprinted through the woods, not caring about our tents or gear, just trying to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. The howls followed us, snapping branches, the rustle of leaves getting closer, faster. My lungs burned, my legs screamed with exhaustion, but I didn't stop. We stumbled upon an old abandoned ranger station, a relic from decades ago. It was barely standing, but it was shelter. We barricaded ourselves inside, hearts pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by our desperate attempts to calm down. And then from outside, the familiar voice. "Hey, you guys okay in there?" It was Dave's voice. But Dave was right next to me. The blood drained from my face. My other friends stared at the door, trembling, wide-eyed. The voice came again, perfectly mimicking Dave's tone, his cadence. "Guys, come on, let me in." No one moved. We sat in stunned silence, paralyzed by fear. The voice outside turned sinister. "Come on, I just want to talk." It wasn't Dave. It wasn't anything human. The thing outside continued to taunt us, its voice shifting, becoming distorted, like a radio stuck between stations. I don't know how long we sat there waiting for it to leave. Hours, maybe. Eventually the forest grew quiet again. No more howls, no more footsteps. Just the dead silence of the night. But here's the part that still haunts me, the part that keeps me awake at night. When we finally built up the courage to leave that rotting ranger station and make our way back to the car, we found something just outside the door. A park ranger's hat, perfectly placed in the dirt, and Dave's voice, laughing softly from the shadows. It started like any other solo camping trip, the kind I've done hundreds of times as a park ranger in the Pacific Northwest. The forest up here has a way of swallowing you whole, but it's always felt like home. That was until last week. I can't explain what happened, but I can't shake the feeling that I was being watched or hunted. It was late September, the time of year when the nights turn cold and the days feel like they're slipping through your fingers. I had a few days off and decided to hike up to one of the more remote areas of the park, where the trees stretch so tall they seem to scrape the sky. No one comes up here this late in the season, not unless you're looking for solitude, the kind that wraps around you like a blanket or a noose, depending on your perspective. The first day went as expected. I hiked up a ridge, pitched my tent by a small stream, and settled in. The air was crisp, the sky a deep bruised purple as dusk settled in. I built a fire, cooked some dinner, and leaned back against my pack, watching the stars prick through the darkening sky. But as the fire crackled and the sounds of the forest faded into the background, I noticed something strange. Silence. Not the regular, peaceful quiet of the wilderness, but a dead, suffocating stillness. No crickets, no wind. Even the water from the stream seemed to hush itself. I tried to shake it off, figuring maybe I was just overthinking things. But then I heard it. A faint rustling just beyond the tree line. I glanced over, expecting to see a deer or maybe even a black bear. Instead, there was nothing. Just thick shadows swaying as if the trees themselves were alive. I told myself it was fine, that I was just tired from the hike and the isolation was getting to me. But when I crawled into my tent, I couldn't sleep. Every few minutes I'd hear that same rustling, faint and inconsistent, like something or someone was circling my camp. It wasn't until around midnight that things got worse. I'd been lying there, wide awake, when I heard something heavy moving through the brush. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My hand instinctively went to the bear spray clipped to my belt, but I stayed quiet, listening. The footsteps stopped at the edge of my campsite. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the thin walls of my tent, praying whatever it was would lose interest and leave. Then I heard it, a low guttural growl, deep and unnatural, like no animal I'd ever heard. I stayed frozen, every muscle in my body tense. The growl turned into a snarl, then a series of rapid clicks, like something was trying to communicate. The footsteps started again, this time moving closer to my tent. I couldn't breathe. The shadow loomed just outside, tall and distorted in the firelight. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the flames, but the shape was all wrong. It looked vaguely human, but hunched over, its arms hanging too low, its head misshapen. And then it spoke, not in a language I understood, but it mimicked my own voice. Help. Please. Help me. It was the sound of me calling out, but warped, distorted, like someone was trying to remember what a human should sound like. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. My mind raced through every story I'd heard about the creatures that stalk these woods, the legends of skinwalkers, shapeshifters, creatures that mimic the voices of the living to lure them out into the dark. I stayed as still as I could, my hand gripping the bear spray so tightly I thought it might snap. The creature circled my tent again, dragging something heavy behind it, something that scraped and thumped against the ground. And then it stopped. The growling, the clicks, the footsteps, they all went silent. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting for dawn, terrified to move or even breathe. When the first light of morning broke through the canvas of my tent, I finally gathered the courage to crawl out. My fire had burned down to embers, and there were deep, jagged marks in the dirt as if something had been dragged away into the woods. But the strangest thing, the thing that still haunts me, was that my own boot prints were everywhere, as if I had been pacing around my camp in the middle of the night, even though I never left my tent. I packed up and started down the trail as fast as I could, keeping my eyes on the trees, listening for any sign that I wasn't alone. But the forest was eerily quiet, just like the night before. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive stillness. As I made my way back to the ranger station, I tried to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a tall, dark figure darting between the trees, always just out of sight. I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I reached the station, something made my blood run cold. My co-worker, Dave, was waiting for me at the entrance, a concerned look on his face. He held up a radio, the same one I always carry with me on hikes. "Found this in the woods," he said, his voice low. "Thought you might have dropped it." I stared at the radio, my stomach twisting into knots. It wasn't mine. I'd left mine back in my truck. Before I could say anything, Dave continued, "You know what's weird, though? I heard you over the radio last night. You were calling for help." I looked at him, the blood draining from my face. "I never used the radio," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Dave frowned, confused, and then the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as he added, "Well, someone did, and they sounded just like you." The forest hasn't felt like home since that night. I don't think it ever will again. Whatever's out there, it's still waiting, and it knows my voice. I wasn't supposed to be out there that night. It was late, and everyone else at the campsite had already turned in, but I couldn't sleep. I'd always loved the night, the quiet, the solitude, the way the world feels different when it's bathed in moonlight. So, I decided to go for a walk, just a quick one, to clear my head. I left the campfire behind, its embers still glowing faintly in the distance as I stepped into the woods. The trees were tall, their branches intertwining overhead, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the stars. The moonlight barely filtered through, but I had my flashlight with me. I wasn't worried. I knew these woods, or at least I thought I did. The trail I followed was narrow, a faint path that looked more like an animal trail than something carved out by humans. I wasn't far from camp, maybe a quarter mile, but already the sounds of the others, the crackling fire, the occasional murmur from a tent had faded. All I could hear now was the soft crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It was peaceful. That's why I didn't turn back right away. The air was cool, and the quiet was calming. I kept walking, enjoying the isolation, but after a few minutes, I noticed something odd. The wind had stopped, and with it, every other sound. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just silence. A silence so deep, it pressed in on me, filling my ears like a weight. I stopped, turning off my flashlight for a moment to let my eyes adjust to the darkness. My breath came out in soft clouds in the cold night air. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, I saw it. Ahead of me, just past the edge of my flashlight's beam, something shifted. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, the way the trees play tricks on your mind in the dark. But then it moved again, slow and deliberate, and I realized it was something tall standing between the trees. I clicked the flashlight back on, sweeping the beam across the woods. The figure was gone. My heart was pounding now, though I wasn't sure why. It was probably just a deer, I told myself, or maybe my eyes playing tricks on me. I took a few more steps down the path, telling myself I was fine, that the woods were safe. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. The air felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating. I turned around, deciding to head back to camp, but when I did, I froze. The path behind me wasn't there anymore. I blinked, shining my light over where the trail should have been. Nothing, just trees. Thick, twisted trees that seemed to have moved, shifted while my back was turned. My breathing quickened. I was sure the trail had been there a second ago. I hadn't gone off it, hadn't wandered far enough to lose it. But now, it was gone. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I'd been hiking these woods for years. I knew how easy it was to get turned around in the dark. All I had to do was retrace my steps, keep moving toward where I thought the camp was, and I'd be fine. But as I walked, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches stretching out like gnarled fingers. That's when I heard the sound. At first it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like something tapping against wood. I stopped, listening, and the sound grew louder, closer, tap, tap, tap. It was coming from behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to run. My instincts were screaming at me. Something wasn't right, something was wrong with these woods. But my legs felt like lead, frozen in place. Tap, 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 and it was louder now, impossibly close, like someone or something was standing right behind me. I finally forced myself to move, slowly turning my head, the flashlight shaking in my hands as I pointed it toward the sound. And then I saw it, a figure standing just a few feet away. Tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, stretching out unnaturally from its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent in the flashlight's beam. And its face, God, its face, it didn't have one. Just a smooth, featureless expanse where eyes, a mouth, should have been. But it wasn't the faceless thing that terrified me the most. It was the sound. That tapping, it was coming from its fingers, long, bony fingers that ended in sharp, pointed nails. It was tapping one of them against a tree rhythmically, like it was counting down to something. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, tapping, watching me, even though it had no eyes. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face as I sprinted blindly through the woods. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop until I burst out of the trees and stumbled into the clearing where our campsite was. I collapsed by the fire, gasping for breath, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. The others were still asleep, the campfire burning low. I looked back toward the trees, expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing, just darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight, jumping at every sound, every rustle of leaves. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things without a word and left, not bothering to explain to the others why I was leaving early. I haven't been back to those woods since. I don't think I ever will, because I know deep down that it's still out there, and it's waiting for me. I've been a park ranger in the remote stretches of Black Creek National Forest for over 5 years. The land is vast and empty, aside from a few trails and campsites. No one ventures too deep into the woods, though. The locals have stories, folk tales really, about things that live out there. They call them whisperers or skinwalkers, but I always dismissed it as superstition. That is, until last week. It started like any other shift. I was scheduled for a 5-day patrol in the deepest part of the forest, far from the well-marked trails. My only company was a radio with patchy reception and a small cabin that served as my base of operations. The isolation never bothered me. In fact, I preferred it. No screaming kids or careless hikers, just the quiet whisper of the trees. On the second night, the radio crackled, pulling me out of a restless sleep. Static filled the airwaves, interspersed with faint, garbled words. I sat up, fumbling to adjust the signal, but all I got was the same jumbled noise. I switched it off, figuring it was just interference, and went back to sleep. The following morning, I found something unsettling. A set of footprints circled the cabin, too large to be human, but far too narrow to belong to a bear or a wolf. They led off into the forest, vanishing into the underbrush. I should have reported it, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow them. The tracks led deeper into the forest than I'd ever been before. The air grew heavy the further I went, the trees standing unnaturally still. No birds, no wind, just silence. I kept moving, telling myself it was probably an animal I didn't recognize. That was until I saw the first one. It looked like a deer at first, standing perfectly still among the trees. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Its eyes, they were too large, too human, and its legs, bent backward at odd angles, trembled as if they were struggling to hold the weight of its own body. It stared at me, unblinking. I stepped back, my pulse pounding in my ears. Without warning, it let out a scream, a shrill, unnatural sound that echoed through the forest. I turned and ran. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and tried to shake off the encounter. My radio was still dead, and I wasn't about to head out again to check the antenna. As night fell, the sound started. First, it was a rustling outside the window, like someone or something was brushing up against the walls. Then came the whispers. They started softly, barely audible, but grew louder as the night wore on. I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to make out the words. It wasn't English. It wasn't even a language I recognized, just guttural, rasping sounds that sent a shiver down my spine. I checked the windows but saw nothing outside. Just the oppressive darkness deeper than any night I'd ever known. Sleep was impossible. I sat by the door, gripping my flashlight and the rifle we were issued for emergencies, waiting for the whispers to stop. They never did. By dawn, the forest was silent again. I ventured outside, exhausted, but determined to figure out what was happening. That's when I saw the totems, roughly a dozen of them, twisted from branches and bones, arranged in a circle around the cabin. They hadn't been there when I went to bed. My stomach dropped. Someone had been out here. Someone, or something, had been watching me. I packed up my things. I didn't care if my patrol was cut short. I needed to get back to the main station and report this. As I headed back, I noticed the trees seemed closer together, their branches weaving into one another like skeletal fingers. The path I'd taken into the woods seemed to shift beneath my feet, leading me in directions I didn't remember. And then, I saw it again. The deer thing, or whatever it was, stood ahead of me on the trail. Only this time, it wasn't alone. There were more of them. Twisted figures, some looking like animals, others like people. But all wrong. Their limbs moved in unnatural jerks, their heads twitching too fast, their mouths opening wide as if to speak, but producing only static, like a broken radio. I raised the rifle, my hands shaking. One of the figures took a step forward, and I froze. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a man. His park ranger uniform was torn. His face stretched into an expression of horror. I recognized him. It was Jacob, another ranger who had gone missing 2 months ago. They said he probably got lost or fell off a cliff. But now I wasn't so sure. And he opened his mouth, and this time I could hear the whispering, clear as day. "Leave." I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the edge of the forest. By the time I made it back to the station, my legs were trembling, my mind spinning. I tried to explain to my supervisor, but all I got in return were skeptical looks and suggestions that I take a few days off. That night, as I lay in my own bed, I heard it again, the whispers, coming from the tree line just outside my window. I haven't gone back to Black Creek since, but every night the voices grow louder, and this morning I found footprints, large, narrow footprints, circling my house. I think they followed me. Or worse, I never left. That was the first thing the park ranger said to us. His voice was low, gravelly, like he'd smoked a pack too many in his life, but something about his tone made my skin prickle. We'd just arrived at the campsite. Me, my girlfriend Sarah, and our friend Tom. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Just us, the wilderness, and some peace away from the chaos of the city. But from the moment we pulled up, something felt off. The ranger stood there leaning against his truck, watching us with eyes that seemed too tired for the middle of the day. He didn't smile, didn't welcome us, just warned us. I laughed it off at first, trying to ease the tension. "Watching us? You mean like bears or something?" He didn't laugh. Instead, his eyes flickered to the tree line, where the pines stood tall and dark, their branches swaying lightly in the breeze. "Not bears," he muttered. "Things older than that, things that wear faces that ain't their own." Sarah shifted uncomfortably next to me, and Tom let out a nervous chuckle. But the ranger just stared at us, his gaze hard and cold. "Stick close to the fire at night," he said. "Don't wander too far, and if you hear someone calling your name from the woods, don't answer." With that, he turned and climbed into his truck, leaving us standing there in the middle of the clearing, a heavy silence settling in his wake. The sun was still up, but it already felt like dusk. The first night wasn't too bad. We set up our tents, made a fire, and tried to shake off the ranger's creepy words. Tom was the first to break the tension, cracking jokes and passing around beers. We laughed, toasted to a good weekend, and the forest around us seemed to lighten up just a bit. But later that night, when the fire had died down and the stars flickered coldly overhead, I heard it. A sound. It was faint at first, almost like the wind whispering through the trees. But then, louder. Crunch. Crunch. Like footsteps, but too slow, too deliberate to be an animal. Sarah stirred beside me, waking up just as I held my breath, listening. I glanced at Tom's tent across the fire, wondering if he'd heard it too. Crunch. I sat up slowly, trying not to make a sound, peering into the darkness beyond the fire's dying embers. The trees loomed, shadows thicker than they should be, their branches swaying with a rhythm that didn't match the breeze. And then I saw it, a figure, just beyond the first line of trees. It looked like a person, but there was something wrong. Their movements were jerky, too stiff, like they didn't quite know how to move right. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Tom?" I whispered, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, swaying slightly, staring. "Tom," I said louder, panic creeping into my voice. But when I looked back at his tent, the flap was zipped tight. There was no way he'd left without me hearing. Sarah grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. "What is that?" I don't know," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Stay here." I grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on, shining it toward the figure. For a second it vanished into the shadows, but then it stepped closer, just enough for the light to catch its face. My blood ran cold. It looked like Tom, but the eyes were wrong, empty, hollow, and the skin too tight, too stretched, like it wasn't meant to be on that face. My stomach lurched as I realized what I was seeing wasn't him. It was wearing him. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The thing cocked its head, mimicking a movement, and in a voice that sounded almost like Tom's but distorted, it said, "Don't be scared." Sarah screamed, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the tent. We zipped it shut, our breaths ragged and panicked as the thing outside circled the campsite, its footsteps slow, deliberate. Too human to be a bear, but not human enough to be anything else. For hours we sat there listening as it moved around, sometimes too close, sometimes drifting farther away. But it never left. The sun didn't rise fast enough. By the next morning the thing was gone. The forest was quiet, too quiet, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Tom didn't remember anything. Said he'd slept like a rock. Didn't hear a thing. But Sarah and I knew what we saw. I wanted to leave, pack up, and get the hell out of there, but Tom laughed it off. Said we were just freaked out by the ranger's ghost stories. He insisted we stay one more night. I didn't want to admit how scared I was. Didn't want to seem paranoid. So we stayed. That night we heard it again, the footsteps. But this time they weren't outside the campsite. They were right outside the tent. The zipper rattled, slow, like something or someone was testing it. Sarah squeezed my hand so hard I thought it would break, and I held the flashlight tight, my heart thundering in my chest. Then, a voice, low, familiar. It was me. From the other side of the tent I heard my own voice whisper, "Let me in." The morning came with silence. No footsteps, no voices, no ranger. Just a feeling. Something darker had moved through those woods that night. Tom still didn't believe us, but when we packed up to leave, I could see the fear in his eyes. He heard it too, even if he wouldn't admit it. As we drove away, I looked back at the trees. The shadows seemed to shift, move, and just before the tree line disappeared, I saw a figure, standing there, watching. It looked just like me, and then it smiled. You ever feel the woods watching you? Now I know what the ranger meant. It was supposed to be a quick, relaxing trip, a weekend spent camping in the woods, far away from the noise of the city, far away from people. That's how it started, at least. A group of friends, a few beers and stories shared around the fire. But by the time the first night fell, things had already started to feel off. We'd chosen a remote spot in Wildwood Forest, miles from the nearest road, following a barely visible trail that wound deep into the wilderness. It was the kind of place you wouldn't find unless you were looking for it. Exactly what we wanted, secluded, untouched, no tourists, no other campers, just us and nature. The ranger at the outpost had given us a strange look when we mentioned where we were headed. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the map we'd shown him, tracing the trail with his finger. "I wouldn't camp too deep in Wildwood," he said finally, his voice low, almost like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "That place, strange things happen there. The deeper you go, the worse it gets." We laughed it off, of course. Strange things. In the woods. That's why we were there. To escape reality for a while. To let our imaginations run wild. But the ranger's words stuck with me, even as we hiked further into the forest, our excitement mounting as we finally reached our campsite. The clearing was perfect, surrounded by tall pines, a small stream running nearby, the ground soft and flat for our tents. As the sun set, we built a fire, cracked open a few beers, and settled in for what we thought would be a fun, carefree night. But as darkness fell, the forest around us seemed to change. The light from the fire only extended so far, leaving the trees just beyond the ring of light shrouded in inky blackness. And that's when we started hearing it. At first, it was just faint, like the sound of leaves crunching or twigs snapping underfoot. We figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, foraging in the underbrush. But the sound didn't go away. It circled the camp, moving slowly, deliberately, just outside the firelight. Jenna was the first to comment on it. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, her eyes scanning the dark woods. "Probably just some wildlife," I said, though I didn't believe it. The footsteps, if that's what they were, sounded too steady, too human. Still, we brushed it off and continued our conversation. But then the noises stopped, and the silence that followed was worse. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. No crickets, no wind, nothing. And that's when the whistling started. It came from the trees, low and soft at first, like someone trying to whistle a tune but not quite getting it right. The melody was broken, disjointed. It would start, then stop, like whoever or whatever was making it didn't know the song. We all went quiet, listening. "Is that a person?" Luke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's another camper," Jenna suggested, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. "There's no one else out here," I said, and I knew I was right. We were miles from any marked trail, and we hadn't seen a single soul on our hike in. We were alone. At least, we were supposed to be. The whistling continued, growing louder, closer. It circled us just like the footsteps had, moving around the camp. But we couldn't see anything. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows, but the woods beyond the light were impenetrable. "Maybe it's a hunter," Luke said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Hunters don't whistle like that," Jenna muttered, her eyes wide, reflecting the flames. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight. "I'll check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The truth was, the sound made my skin crawl. It wasn't just eerie. It was wrong, like something was trying to imitate a human but couldn't quite get it right. I stepped toward the edge of the clearing, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. I swept the light across the trees, searching for anything that could explain the sound. But there was nothing, just shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "Is someone there?" No answer. I stepped further into the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of my flashlight flickered, just for a second, but long enough to make me stop. I tapped it against my palm, cursing the cheap batteries. And then, just beyond the reach of the light, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing between the trees. At first I thought it was a person, maybe a lost hiker or a hunter. But the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't right. Its arms were too long, its posture too rigid. And its face, it was pale, almost glowing in the dim light, but completely featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth white skin. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak, I just stood there frozen, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Then the whistling started again, but this time it came from the figure. It didn't have a mouth, but somehow the sound was coming from it, that same broken, disjointed melody, echoing through the trees. My flashlight flickered again, and when the beam stabilized, the figure was gone. Vanished. Like it had never been there at all. I stumbled back to the campsite, my heart racing. Luke and Jenna were both standing now, their faces pale, eyes wide. "You saw it, didn't you?" Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, unable to form words. Without saying anything else, we packed up camp in record time. We didn't talk about it, didn't even look at each other, just moved as quickly as we could. By the time we were done, the first hint of dawn was creeping over the horizon. We hiked out in silence, none of us daring to look back. When we finally made it back to the car, Luke broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how to explain it, but as we drove away from Wildwood Forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't been alone out there, and I couldn't forget the way that thing had stood there, watching me with a face that wasn't a face at all. I haven't been back to Wildwood since. None of us have. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I can still hear that broken, haunting whistle, and I wonder, what would have happened if I had followed it? I didn't believe the stories at first. You hear things when you grow up in a small town. Legends about the woods, warnings passed down from old folks who seem to enjoy scaring kids more than anything else. But after what happened last night, I'm not laughing anymore. I'm a camper. Well, more like a hobbyist. I've spent most weekends out in the wilderness, alone with my tent, my gear, and the solitude. It's peaceful. A way to clear my head after a long week in the city. The town I live near, Maple Hollow, is quiet and out of the way, and there are some great trails around here. The kind that make you forget the world exists. But there's one area no one goes near, Black Pines. The forest stretches for miles, dense and dark, the kind of place that swallows the light by mid-afternoon. No marked trails, no campers, no hikers. The locals call it cursed. They talk about creatures, strange figures that mimic people, sounds that draw you deeper until you're too lost to find your way back. I always thought it was nonsense, until now. It started when I got the bright idea to camp there, just for the weekend, a challenge. I was sick of the usual spots, bored of the easy terrain, and I figured, why not? If there was nothing to fear, what did I have to lose? The stories are just stories, right? I wish I hadn't been so cocky. I set up camp just before dusk, a little deeper in than I usually go. The woods felt different. Even though it was just the edge of Black Pines, the air was heavier. The trees seemed too close together, their branches twisted like arthritic fingers, black against the fading sky. But I told myself it was just nerves. First-time jitters in an unfamiliar spot. The first hour was fine. I cooked dinner over the fire, listened to the crackle of the flames, watched the stars peek through the thick canopy. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. It began with the wind, or what I thought was wind. A low, steady rustling like the trees were whispering to each other. But there was no breeze. The air was completely still. I paused, fork halfway to my mouth, straining to hear. The sound was growing, surrounding me, like dozens of voices murmuring just out of earshot. Then I heard the laughter. It was faint at first, like a child giggling in the distance. I stood up, staring into the blackness beyond my campfire, squinting into the dense line of trees. Nothing. Just the endless dark. I should have packed up right then and there. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I convinced myself it was just an echo, maybe a group of hikers messing around somewhere far off. But it wasn't. As the night wore on, the laughter got louder, sharper. It was coming from different directions now. One moment to the left, the next right behind me, and that wasn't the worst part. It was starting to sound closer. Not children, not hikers. Something else. I doused the fire, plunging myself into the cold dark, hoping that whatever was out there would leave me alone if I was quiet enough. But the voices didn't stop. Instead, they multiplied. Whispers that weren't mine, soft and low, like someone or something was right behind me. I could hear breathing, ragged and slow. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding in my chest, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to see whatever was making those sounds. And then it spoke. Come closer. I froze. My blood ran cold as the voice echoed through the trees. It wasn't distant anymore. It was right next to my ear, low, gravelly, dripping with malice, and worse, it sounded like me. Like my own voice, distorted, twisted into something foul. Come closer. I whipped around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, finally clicking it on. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but branches and leaves. But I knew something was out there. I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The laughter came again, louder this time, closer, and then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, and thin. Its limbs were too long, its head slightly tilted, as if it was studying me. The darkness clung to it like a shadow, hiding its features. But its eyes... God, its eyes... They glowed faintly, reflecting the beam of my flashlight. I couldn't tell if they were human, but I knew they weren't friendly. The thing took a step forward, moving with an unnatural grace. It didn't make a sound, not even a crunch of leaves beneath its feet. I stumbled back, heart racing, legs trembling. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. And then it spoke again, in my voice, perfectly, mocking. "Don't leave. Stay." It smiled. I could see its teeth now, sharp and white, gleaming in the darkness like knives. They were too long for its mouth, like they had been crammed into a space too small for them. I ran. I didn't care where, didn't care if I tripped over rocks or branches. I just needed to get out. But as I sprinted through the woods, I realized something horrifying. The footsteps behind me weren't mine. Whatever it was fast. I could hear it gaining on me, its laughter rising, twisting, becoming something unholy. It sounded like a chorus of voices, all using my voice, mimicking me, laughing, screaming, calling for help. And then, through the madness, I heard my own voice call out from behind me. The real me. "Don't run." I didn't stop. Couldn't. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept going. I could hear the thing closing in, feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. I was almost out of the woods when it happened. The sound of my own voice, but this time right in front of me. "Help me." I froze. For a split second I saw it again, standing just beyond the tree line, grinning with those awful teeth. But this time, it had my face. I collapsed on the other side of the forest, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my ears. When I finally looked back, it was gone. The woods were silent again, as if nothing had ever happened. I'm not going back in there. I don't care what anyone says or what I left behind. Something's out there in black pines. Something that wears your face, steals your voice, and waits for you to come close enough to take you. And when it does, no one ever finds your body. No one even remembers you were there. I wasn't supposed to be there. I knew that from the moment I stepped off the trail, the warnings buzzing in the back of my head like an irritating gnat. The signs had been clear. Stay on marked paths. Report all strange sightings. But something about the solitude of the woods had pulled me in deeper until I was miles away from the main campsite. That's what I wanted after all. Peace. No people, just me and the forest. The sun was sinking fast behind the trees, casting long shadows across the underbrush. The air had that sticky, cool bite that comes just before dusk, and I knew I had to set up camp soon. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but the isolation felt different this time. The woods were thicker here, the sounds more muted, as if the trees themselves were listening. I found a small clearing perfect for my tent and a little fire. I was halfway through setting up when I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. They were distant but deliberate, and they didn't belong to any animal. They were too heavy for that. "Hello?" I called, but my voice felt weak against the growing night. There was no response, just the sound of those footsteps getting closer, then stopping suddenly. The forest went eerily quiet again. I shook it off. Probably just another camper off the trail, I thought, though I hadn't seen anyone all day. There was something comforting about that idea. Another human being out here. That thought, however, quickly dissolved when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. At first I couldn't quite place what I was seeing, just a flash of movement, too fast and too far to make out. But there was something wrong about it. The way it moved, low to the ground, almost crawling, but with a fluidity that made my skin crawl. I turned fully toward the spot where I'd seen it, flashlight ready, but there was nothing there, just trees and the encroaching darkness. I swallowed hard and got back to setting up camp, trying to push the growing unease from my mind. By the time the fire was crackling, the woods had become a shadowy maze. The sounds had returned, night birds calling out, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of the wind, but something still felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. An hour passed, maybe more. I was lost in thought, staring into the flames, when the snap of a branch made me jerk upright. This time the sound was closer, much closer. I shot up, grabbed my flashlight, and swung the beam in a wide arc around the campsite. The light cut through the dark but revealed only trees and undergrowth. My heart pounded in my ears. "Who's out there?" I shouted, hoping my voice didn't betray my fear. The silence that followed was absolute, crushing. Then a voice answered, a low, raspy whisper that made my blood turn cold. "Help me." I blinked, unsure if I'd actually heard it. The voice was so faint, so wrong. It was human, but warped, like someone who hadn't spoken in years was trying to remember how. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling now. The response was immediate, closer than before. "Please, help me." I swept the flashlight around frantically, trying to pinpoint the source. My heart leaped into my throat when the light caught something, eyes glowing faintly in the dark, low to the ground. They blinked, and then they were gone, vanishing into the blackness. I backed up toward the fire, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. A trick of the light? An animal? But the voice, it had been human. I was sure of it. Another snap, this time directly behind me. I spun around, light shaking in my hand, and froze. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a man. Or at least, it looked like a man. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched too tightly over his bones, his eyes sunken and hollow. His clothes were torn, ragged, hanging from his thin frame like they didn't belong to him. "Help me," he rasped again, but his lips didn't move. The voice was coming from him, but it was all wrong, like a ventriloquist's puppet. He took a step forward, his limbs jerky, unnatural. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking wildly in my hand. I can get help," I stammered. I'll call someone. Just stay there." But he didn't stop. Another step and then another, his movements becoming faster, more erratic. As he approached, I realized with dawning horror that his skin, it wasn't right. It was shifting, sliding over his muscles like a loose sheet, like it didn't quite fit. I turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face. My only thought was to run, to get away from whatever that thing was. The footsteps behind me were fast, impossibly fast, keeping pace with me no matter how hard I pushed myself. That awful voice echoed through the trees, distorted and wrong. "Help me! Don't leave me!" I didn't stop, couldn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I ran until I burst out onto the main trail, the dirt path suddenly familiar and grounding. I skidded to a halt, gasping for air, and turned to look behind me. Nothing. The woods were empty, quiet. I didn't stick around to question it. I sprinted back toward the ranger station, desperate for the safety of lights, of people. When I burst through the door, breathless and wild-eyed, the ranger on duty looked up from his desk, startled. "You all right, buddy?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I tried to explain, the words tumbling out of me in a frantic mess. "There's something out there, a man but not a man. He was chasing me. His skin, it wasn't right." The ranger's face darkened, and he stood slowly, grabbing a flashlight from his desk. "You weren't off the trail, were you?" he asked, his tone low. I nodded, my pulse still pounding in my ears. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "You're lucky you made it back. Most don't." What was that thing?" I asked, still shaking. The ranger glanced toward the window as if expecting to see something lurking in the dark. Then he turned back to me, his eyes cold, almost sad. "You've heard of skinwalkers, right?" I shook my head, but I'd heard the stories, the legends. Just campfire tales, I'd thought. "They're real," he said flatly, "and they don't like people wandering into their territory." I felt the blood drain from my face. "But you're here. It can't follow me, right?" The ranger gave me a long, hard look, and then, without a word, he slowly began to peel off his skin. His eyes gleamed, black as pitch. "Who says I didn't?" I never believed in cryptids or any of that supernatural nonsense. My idea of a scary story involved a good thriller movie, maybe a haunted house tour around Halloween. Real-life horror was just, well, real. Bills, jobs, and responsibilities. But I'll never be the same after what happened on that camping trip last fall. It was supposed to be a solo trip, just me and nature. I needed a break from the grind, from people, from everything. The forest always helped me clear my head, and this time I was going deeper than ever before into the wilderness of Montana. No campsites, no trails, just a map, a compass, and miles of untouched forest. The first 2 days were bliss. The air was crisp, the forest was alive, and I didn't see a single soul. I pitched my tent on the third night at the edge of a small clearing. The sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the ground. As the darkness crept in, I built a fire and settled in with a book. The crackling of the fire and the soft chirp of crickets were the only sounds for miles. It was perfect. But that night, something changed. It started subtly. The fire was getting low, and as I went to throw another log on it, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling from the tree line. At first I figured it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon scavenging. I didn't think much of it. Then I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer, twigs snapping. I turned my flashlight toward the woods, scanning the dense brush. Nothing. Just shadows and trees swaying in the wind. I shrugged it off, but the hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I sat back down by the fire. That's when I noticed it. Silence. The crickets had stopped. The wind had died down. The woods were unnaturally quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. And in that silence, I felt it. That creeping sensation. The one that claws at your gut and tells you something isn't right. Like eyes were on me. Watching. Waiting. I stood up, scanning the tree line again with my flashlight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the light of my fire, hiding in the dark. I threw another log onto the fire, hoping the flames would push back the shadows, give me some comfort. But the feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger. I tried to distract myself, went back to reading, but my eyes kept flicking up, scanning the woods. It felt like the darkness was pressing in, suffocating. A sudden loud crack snapped me out of my thoughts. My heart leapt into my throat, and I jumped to my feet, shining the flashlight toward the noise. I was sure I'd see an animal, maybe a bear lumbering through the underbrush. But there was nothing. Nothing except the faintest glimpse of movement. A shadow, impossibly tall, slipping between the trees. My stomach turned as I realized the shadow had been standing still, blending in with the trunks, watching me. It had only moved when the beam of my light swept over it. My breath hitched, and I stepped back toward the fire. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and a chill crept through me. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, the fire casting strange shadows. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was out there. I sat by the fire for what felt like hours, gripping my flashlight, my ears straining for any sound. The woods had come alive again, but not in the way I wanted. Every little noise, every rustle, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was getting closer. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I woke to the sound of heavy breathing. It was faint but distinct, and it wasn't mine. My eyes snapped open, and I stayed perfectly still, listening. The fire had burned low, barely more than embers now, casting long shadows that danced across the clearing. The breathing came again, deep, slow, and ragged, like it was coming from something large. I turned my head ever so slightly, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. And then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, standing between two trees, was a figure. It was tall, too tall, towering over the bushes, its outline barely visible in the faint glow of the dying fire. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to make sense of it. At first I thought it was a person, but no human could stand that tall, not without some kind of unnatural distortion. Its limbs were elongated, unnaturally thin, and its head, God, its head, was wrong. Too narrow, almost like a deer's skull, but stretched and twisted. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. Just black, empty voids where its face should be. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe, my body was frozen with fear as the thing just stood there watching me. Then, without warning, it moved. It didn't walk, it didn't even seem to shift its weight. One moment it was standing still, and the next, it was gliding, sliding through the trees like a shadow, noiseless and impossibly fast. It circled the edge of the clearing, always staying just out of the fire's dying light. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was rooted to the spot, my hands shaking as I clutched the flashlight. The thing kept circling, moving faster now, closer. Then it stopped, right at the edge of the firelight. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel it. It was waiting. Suddenly the fire flared, casting a brief flash of light, and for the first time I saw its face. It wasn't a deer, it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. Its skin was pale and stretched too tight over its bones, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, sharp teeth glinting in the firelight. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were sunken, black pits, hollow and endless. In that split second, I knew I wasn't making it out of there. But then it did something I didn't expect. It turned its head slowly toward the woods behind me, like it had seen something. And then it ran. Not toward me, but away, vanishing into the trees without a sound. I didn't wait to find out why. I grabbed my pack, bolted for the trail, and didn't stop running until I reached my car, miles away. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to know. But I do know this. There was something else in those woods that night, something even it was afraid of. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the cool night air as I leaned back against my backpack, staring up at the thick canopy of trees above us. The sky was barely visible through the dense branches, and the stars that managed to peek through seemed cold and distant. My friends Ethan and Jess were sitting across from me, warming their hands by the fire. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend, 3 days deep in the forest, far from cell service, far from work, far from the stress of life, just us and nature. But something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but from the moment we set up camp earlier that evening, a strange unease had settled over me. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, not even the sound of wind through the trees. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. Ethan seemed oblivious, poking the fire with a stick. "Man, this place is amazing," he said, his voice breaking the silence that had been lingering between us. "We should come out here more often." Jess nodded, but her eyes kept darting around the perimeter of our camp. I wasn't the only one feeling uneasy. "Yeah, it's beautiful, but I don't know. There's something weird about these woods." I glanced at her. "You feel it too?" She nodded slowly, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. "It's like we're being watched." Ethan laughed, trying to brush it off. "Come on, you guys, it's just your mind playing tricks on you. We're out in the middle of nowhere. Of course it feels a little creepy." But Jess and I weren't convinced. The feeling was too strong to ignore. As the night wore on, we tried to shake it off, talking and joking around, but the tension in the air never really left. Eventually, we all decided to call it a night. Jess went to her tent, Ethan to his, and I was left alone by the fire, staring into the dying embers, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. That's when I heard it. A low, distant howl carried on the still air. It wasn't a wolf. It was deeper, more guttural, like something trying to mimic a wolf's howl but not quite getting it right. My skin prickled, and I stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The howl came again, this time closer. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on, the beam cutting through the blackness. The trees loomed like silent sentinels around me, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly turned in a circle, listening. Then, footsteps, light, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. Something was moving through the forest, slowly, deliberately. "Ethan," I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. "Jess?" Still nothing. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The footsteps stopped. Silence. For a long moment, all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, telling myself it was just an animal. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the firelight just inside the tree line. Tall, thin, unnaturally still. My breath caught in my throat as I turned the flashlight towards it. It was Jess. Or at least it looked like her. But something was wrong. She was standing too rigid, her arms hanging limply at her sides, her head tilted at an odd angle. Her eyes, wide, unblinking, stared straight ahead, unfocused. "Jess," I whispered, my voice shaking. "What are you doing?" She didn't respond. She just stood there, staring, her body swaying slightly, like a puppet hanging from invisible strings. A chill crawled down my spine, and I took a step back. "Jess?" Then she smiled. But it wasn't her smile. It was too wide, too forced, stretching her lips in a grotesque imitation of a human expression. Her teeth gleamed in the firelight, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. That's when she spoke. "I'm fine," she said, but the voice, it wasn't hers. It sounded like her, but there was something off. A distortion, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Come into the woods with me." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I stood frozen, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Come with me," she repeated, stepping closer, her movements jerky, unnatural. Behind her, deeper in the forest, I saw something else. Another figure standing in the shadows watching, taller, darker. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the darkness. My stomach lurched as I realized it was the source of the howling. It was watching Jess, or whatever had taken her form. "Come, with me," she said again, her voice breaking, glitching. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. I turned and bolted for Ethan's tent, my heart slamming against my ribs. I threw open the flap and shook him awake. "Ethan, get up. There's something out there," I hissed, my voice trembling. He groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. What are you talking about?" "Jess, there's something wrong with her. We have to go." But before I could finish, the tent flap slowly unzipped behind me. Ethan froze, his eyes going wide as he stared over my shoulder. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see it, but I had to. Slowly I turned, my heart hammering in my chest. Jess stood there in the entrance, her face twisted into that same unnatural smile. Her eyes, empty, hollow, locked onto mine. And then she spoke again. But this time, it wasn't her voice. It was mine. "Come into the woods with me," she said, her lips curling into that horrible grin. I didn't wait. I grabbed Ethan, yanking him out of the tent, and we ran, blindly, recklessly, into the night. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and contorting as we crashed through the underbrush. Behind us, I could hear it, the thing that wore Jess's face. And worse, I could hear something else. A second voice, Ethan's. "Come into the woods with me," it whispered, closer than it should have been. We didn't stop running until we reached the ranger station at the edge of the park. When we burst through the door, out of breath and panicked, the ranger looked up at us with wide eyes. "You're lucky," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Not many people make it back from those woods." We never found Jess. I was never one for camping, but when my friends Ben, Jess, and Mark pitched the idea of a weekend in the woods, I couldn't say no. Maybe it was the way they made it sound so idyllic. No cell service, no work, just the four of us and nature. I figured I could handle a couple of days away from civilization. Just 2 nights, and then we'd be back in the real world. We should have stayed there. We drove out to a spot Ben had found online, some forgotten patch of wilderness a few hours out of town. No marked trails, no campsites, just pure isolation. It was exactly what they wanted. "An adventure," Ben had said, grinning as we pulled up to a dirt clearing that passed as a parking lot. We unloaded the gear and set off into the trees, leaving behind the only semblance of humanity. The deeper we hiked, the quieter it got. The sounds of birds, the rustle of leaves, all of it seemed to fade away until all I could hear was the crunch of our boots and my own breathing. I tried to shake the feeling of unease creeping up my spine, but it lingered like a shadow, growing heavier with each step. We set up camp near a small creek just before dusk, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The place was beautiful in that haunting, untouched way that some forests have. But as the sun started to sink below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows through the trees, I couldn't help but feel like we were intruding. The first night went fine, at least until we all settled down around the fire. Jess was telling some stupid story about a haunted cabin or something, one of those urban legends you tell to spook your friends. But as the story went on, the fire crackled and popped, throwing weird shadows against the trees, and that's when I heard it. A low, distant hum. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it didn't sound like wind. It sounded off. "Do you hear that?" I interrupted, looking toward the darkness. "Hear what?" Mark asked, poking at the fire with a stick. "That humming," I said, straining to listen. It was faint, but steady, like a distant engine. But there was no one out here. No roads, no cabins, nothing. The others stopped talking, and for a second, we all sat there in silence. Jess shook her head. "You're hearing things, man." "Probably just the creek," Ben added, though his voice wavered just enough to tell me he wasn't sure. I let it go, but that unease, the sense that something wasn't right, it stuck with me. The humming eventually faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't gone away. Not really. We turned in for the night, each retreating to our tents. The fire burned low, casting a weak glow across the camp as I zipped myself into my sleeping bag. I tried to focus on the familiar sounds, the rustle of leaves, the gurgle of the creek, the occasional hoot of an owl. But underneath it all, I could still hear that low hum, like it was just beneath the surface of reality. I must have fallen asleep at some point because when I woke up, the fire was out, and the night was unnervingly silent. And then there was the sound, a twig snapping, close. My heart pounded as I listened, frozen in place. Another snap, then a soft rustling, like something, or someone, was moving just outside the tent. I held my breath, ears straining to pick up every little noise. There it was again, a faint shuffling circling the camp. I reached over and shook Mark's shoulder. He groaned, half asleep. "Mark, wake up," I whispered. "There's something outside." He opened one bleary eye and listened. "It's probably a raccoon or something. Go back to sleep." But it didn't sound like a raccoon. It sounded bigger, heavier. Before I could say anything else, there was a low growl. deep, guttural, and far too close for comfort. Mark shot up, now fully awake, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Yeah," he whispered back, grabbing the flashlight from his bag. "Stay quiet." We both sat there, hearts racing, listening to the soft crunch of leaves. Then, with trembling hands, Mark unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. He flicked on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the campsite. At first there was nothing, just trees and darkness. But then, at the edge of the light, I saw it. A figure. Tall, pale, and hunched over, like it was too large for its own body. It was standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. "Jesus Christ," Mark breathed, and I knew he saw it too. We sat frozen, staring at the thing. It didn't move. It just stood there, silent, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Then, slowly, it took a step forward, coming into the light. My stomach dropped. It looked human, but something was horribly wrong. Its limbs were too long, its skin too smooth, and its eyes, oh God, its eyes, were black and empty, like it was something wearing a human body, but didn't know how. Mark yanked the tent shut, his face pale. "We need to get out of here." We grabbed our gear, trying to stay quiet, but every sound we made felt deafening in the stillness. I could feel the thing watching us, feel its gaze burning into the back of my neck. The others hadn't woken up yet, but as soon as we unzipped the tent, Ben and Jess stirred. We told them what we saw, but they didn't believe us at first. They thought it was some kind of prank. That is, until we heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, coming closer. Ben's face went pale, and without a word, we all grabbed what we could and started running. We didn't care about the trail, didn't care about where we were going. We just needed to get away. The woods were pitch black, the trees closing in on us like they were alive. Branches clawed at our arms and legs, but we didn't stop. The humming was back, louder this time, vibrating in my skull. It felt like it was coming from all around us, like the forest itself was alive with it. We ran for what felt like hours, our breaths ragged, hearts pounding, until we finally broke through the trees and stumbled back to the car. We threw ourselves inside, and Ben floored it, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching hold. We didn't stop driving until we hit the nearest town. None of us have talked about it since, but every now and then, when I'm lying in bed late at night, I hear it again. That low, insistent hum, just on the edge of hearing, and I know it's still out there, waiting. I've always loved camping. Something about the solitude of the woods, the crackling fire, and the endless stretch of stars above has always called to me. I needed a break from the chaos of work, so when the opportunity came for a weekend in the Appalachian wilderness, I jumped at it. Just me, a tent, and the serenity of nature. The park was massive, a sprawling patch of untouched forest. The ranger at the station when I checked in gave me a friendly warning. Just be mindful of your surroundings. These woods, they get confusing if you wander too far off the trail. He was an older guy, leathery skin from too many years in the sun, and a strange look in his eye as he handed me a map. "Anything specific I should be worried about?" I asked with a laugh, thinking he might mention bears or wolves. He stared at me for a second too long, then said, "Just stay close to the trail. The forest plays tricks." It was weird, but I brushed it off. Rangers like to keep the mystery alive. Adds to the charm, I thought. I found my campsite late in the afternoon, a small clearing deep in the woods, far from the main trails. Perfect. I pitched my tent, set up a fire pit, and relaxed, listening to the sounds of nature. Birds, the wind rustling through the trees, the distant rush of a stream. The forest was alive, yet peaceful. As the sun dipped lower, the atmosphere shifted. The forest, once vibrant, began to feel stifling. The wind died down. The birds went quiet. I convinced myself it was just the transition from day to night. Still, something felt off. It wasn't until I was sitting by the fire that I started to notice the sounds. At first, it was faint. Footsteps, maybe? light, deliberate. I told myself it was an animal, a deer probably, but then I heard it again, closer this time, slow, calculated. I turned my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing, just an endless stretch of towering pines and thick underbrush. But the feeling in my gut told me I wasn't alone. I shrugged it off and tried to settle back into the warmth of the fire, but then, right at the edge of the clearing, I saw movement, just a glimpse like a shadow flitting between the trees. My breath caught, and my heart raced. "Hello?" I called out, hoping it was just another camper. Silence. I scanned the tree line, but the figure was gone. My skin prickled, and I suddenly felt very exposed. I turned the flashlight back on, sweeping it across the darkness. Still nothing. Maybe it was the ranger checking up on me, I thought, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. Trying to calm myself, I decided to turn in early. The safety of my tent felt comforting, though I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak, every rustle outside had me wide awake, clutching the flashlight. At one point I swore I heard whispering, low and unintelligible, drifting in the wind. My brain must have been playing tricks on me. I hadn't seen another soul out here since I arrived. Then came the scratching, soft at first, like something was brushing against the nylon of my tent. My breath hitched. I didn't move. I just listened. The sound circled the tent, moving slowly, deliberately, like it, whatever it was testing, probing. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent just a fraction, shining the light outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty clearing. My heart pounded in my chest. But as I scanned the perimeter, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just beyond the reach of the light, standing between two trees, was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and thin to be human. It was like a shadow. No, darker than a shadow. Its face. I couldn't see its face, just the outline, barely visible, but enough to fill me with a primal dread. I slammed the tent shut and scrambled for my phone. No service, of course. Panic set in. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. It had to be a trick of the light. I was tired, scared, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Right? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The scratching came and went, always just faint enough to make me question if I was imagining it. When dawn finally broke, I packed up as fast as I could. I needed to get out of there, back to the ranger station, back to civilization. But as I was folding up my tent, I noticed something that stopped me cold. There in the dirt were tracks, not animal tracks, not human either. They were large, clawed, and deeply pressed into the earth, like something heavy had been walking around my campsite all night. I snapped a picture, my hands shaking, before grabbing my gear and heading down the trail as fast as I could. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. I just needed to make it back. The hike felt longer than I remembered, the trees closer, almost suffocating. But as I neared the ranger station, I finally started to relax. I was safe. It was over. But as I approached the station, I saw the ranger from yesterday standing outside, watching me. Relief washed over me, and I hurried toward him. "You weren't supposed to go that far in," he said before I could speak. His voice was cold, distant. "I stayed near the trail," I replied, confused. "I didn't get lost." He didn't say anything, just stared at me with that same unsettling look from the day before. That's when I noticed something was wrong. His skin, it looked off, like it didn't fit right. His eyes, too bright, too wide. And then I realized something horrifying. The ranger from yesterday was shorter. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my ears. This wasn't the same man. "Should have stayed on the trail," he said again, but his voice had changed. It was deeper, guttural, almost animalistic. I bolted for my car, not daring to look back. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that cursed forest. But even now, weeks later, I still can't shake the feeling that something followed me. Sometimes late at night, I hear scratching at my window. I've always loved camping, the solitude, the escape from the grind of daily life, the quiet that you can only find deep in the woods. For years I'd been taking solo trips into the wild, but nothing prepared me for what happened last fall. I don't talk about it much. People wouldn't believe me if I did. Hell, I'm not even sure I believe it myself. It was early October, the air cool with the first hints of winter creeping in. I'd picked a spot far off the beaten path, about a 2-day hike from the nearest trailhead. A perfect, isolated haven deep in the forest. There was no one for miles, just me, my gear, and the whisper of the trees swaying in the wind. I set up camp by a small lake, the water dark and still, reflecting the dense pine forest that stretched out endlessly in every direction. The first night was peaceful, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat. I stayed up late by the fire, watching the embers glow under a blanket of stars, before crawling into my tent for the night. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, insects buzzing, seemed to fade as the day wore on. By mid-afternoon, there was only silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just nothing. It was like the woods were holding their breath. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe a storm was coming, I told myself. Animals always go quiet before a storm. But as I gathered firewood that evening, I started to get the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. You know that sensation you get when someone's watching you, that prickling on the back of your neck? I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing. Just trees, dense and dark, their shadows growing longer as the sun sank lower in the sky. Back at camp, I built up the fire and sat close, my unease growing with the darkness. The quiet was oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I thought about packing up and heading out, but it was too late in the day. It wasn't safe to navigate the woods at night. Then I heard it. A low guttural growl, faint but unmistakable, came from somewhere deep in the forest behind me. I froze, my eyes scanning the tree line, but I couldn't see anything. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that made the woods look alive, shifting and swaying. I told myself it was just a bear, or maybe a wolf. I'd dealt with animals before, and as long as I stayed by the fire, I'd be safe. But the growling didn't stop. It circled the camp, moving slowly, methodically. Sometimes it would fade, only to start up again from a different direction. Whatever it was stalking me, watching. By now my heart was pounding in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth. Nothing. The woods swallowed the light, revealing only twisted branches and the occasional glint of something far off, something reflective, like eyes. But they were gone before I could focus on them. The growling stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so deep it rang in my ears. I stood there, listening, straining to hear anything, and then I heard a new sound. A voice. My voice. It was distant, echoing through the trees, a perfect mimicry of my own. Help. Please. Help. It called, distorted, like it was being dragged through water. My blood ran cold. I whipped around, scanning the darkness, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it seemed to move, circling the camp like the growl had. Then I saw it. A shape, barely visible at the edge of the firelight. At first it looked like a person standing just within the shadow of the trees. My flashlight flickered over it, catching glimpses of pale skin and long limbs. It stood too still, too straight, like it wasn't used to being on 2 feet. My voice came again from its direction, but now it was louder, closer, like it was coming from right behind me. I turned, heart hammering in my chest, but no one was there. When I turned back to the figure, it had moved closer, just at the edge of the light now. My skin crawled as I realized it wasn't human. Its proportions were all wrong. Its arms too long, its legs bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. It had no eyes, just dark sunken holes where they should have been, and its mouth was a wide slit, grinning with too many teeth. The thing spoke again, this time in a garbled whisper that barely sounded human. "Come here." I backed away slowly, my flashlight flickering in my shaking hand. The thing stepped into the light, and I saw it clearly for the first time. Its skin was mottled and gray, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at sharp angles. It had no nose, just slits where its nostrils should be, and its grin widened unnaturally as it crouched low, preparing to pounce. I did the only thing I could think of. I threw the flashlight at it and bolted for my tent. I barely made it inside before I heard the sound of it crashing through the trees after me. My heart pounded in my throat as I grabbed my knife and sat, shaking, waiting for it to tear through the thin fabric. But it didn't. The thing stopped just outside the tent, its breath rasping and wet, like it was trying to mimic the sound of breathing. I could hear it sniffing, shuffling around, circling. My own breath was ragged, loud in the silence, but I stayed still, gripping the knife until my knuckles turned white. Then it spoke again, this time in a perfect copy of my own voice, just inches from the tent. "Let me in." I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I even blinked. I just sat there, listening as it circled, over and over, repeating the same phrase in my voice, sometimes laughing quietly to itself, other times growling low in its throat. At some point, it stopped. The sun rose, and the sounds of the forest returned as if nothing had happened. I stepped out of the tent cautiously, knife in hand, but the thing was gone. Only deep, clawed tracks in the dirt circled my camp, evidence that it hadn't been a nightmare. I packed up and left within the hour, not stopping until I was back at my car. I've never gone back to that part of the forest. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm home, I still hear my own voice calling to me from the woods, asking to be let in. I always considered myself an experienced camper. I'd been hiking and camping in remote places for years, usually solo. There was something about being out there, surrounded by nothing but nature, that made me feel alive. The silence, the fresh air, it gave me a sense of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. But there was this one spot I'd heard whispers about, a place deep in the Montana wilderness. People talked about it in hushed tones, calling it the Hollow. It was said to be untouched, an area so remote that it wasn't even on most maps. But the stories were always vague, filled with odd warnings. Don't camp near the trees, or stay away from the fog if it rolls in. It was the kind of folklore that most outdoorsmen laugh off. But of course it piqued my curiosity. I decided that was my next destination. After some digging and old map cross-referencing, I found the general location. It wasn't easy to get to. 2 days of hiking through dense forest, no trails, no markers, nothing. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. By the second day, even the birds had stopped singing. Still, it didn't bother me. I'd been in plenty of quiet forests before. The silence just meant I was far from civilization, exactly what I wanted. Late that afternoon, I found the perfect spot to set up camp. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with just enough space for my tent. There was a stream nearby which would be good for water, and the sun filtered through the trees in soft, golden beams. It was perfect, picturesque even. As the sun began to set, I built a fire, ate my dinner, and settled into my usual routine. By the time the stars were out, I was leaning back against a log, staring up at the sky. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a mist forming, creeping out from the trees. It started off slow, just a thin veil hanging low to the ground, but it thickened quickly, swirling at the edge of the clearing like it was alive. I stood up watching it. I'd seen fog before, of course, but this was different. It didn't move naturally. It stopped right at the line of trees, refusing to come any closer to my camp, almost as if it was waiting. "Just weather," I muttered to myself, though a knot of unease had begun to form in my stomach. I went to bed earlier than usual that night, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me. The mist still hovered at the edges of the clearing, thick and unmoving. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire had long since died, and my tent was pitch black. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. There was no sound, no breeze rustling the trees, no animal calls, just absolute silence. And then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. It was coming from outside the tent, but it wasn't close. Maybe at the edge of the clearing. I listened for a few seconds, heart racing, trying to make sense of it. There was no wind, nothing that should have been moving. The tapping grew louder, closer. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, my flashlight in hand, scanning the area. The mist was still there, thick and swirling just beyond the tree line. But now, shapes moved within it, dark, shifting forms, tall and thin. I couldn't make out any details, just long, shadowy figures pacing in and out of view. And then I saw it, something standing at the very edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the fog. It was tall, taller than any man, with impossibly long arms that seemed to drag along the ground. Its head was wrong, elongated, almost like it was wearing a mask, a pale oval where a face should have been. It was tapping its fingers on a tree, the sound carrying through the silent forest like a drumbeat. I froze. The figure stood perfectly still, but I knew it was aware of me. Its head was tilted slightly like it was listening. Then, without warning, it stopped tapping and stepped forward, just one long, slow stride. I panicked. I zipped the tent shut, clutching the flashlight like it was some kind of shield. My mind raced. I could hear the tapping again, louder now, closer. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to stay quiet, listening. I needed to think. What was that thing, and why hadn't it come closer? That's when I realized. The fog. It hadn't crossed the line of the clearing. Whatever that thing was, it stayed within the mist. I didn't know why, but for the moment, it seemed like the only thing keeping me safe. The tapping continued, circling the camp, always staying just beyond the edge of the clearing. I lay there, wide awake, my mind racing as the hours crawled by. Then, just before dawn, the tapping stopped. I listened for what felt like an eternity, but the forest remained silent. No footsteps, no whispers, nothing but the soft rustle of leaves as the wind finally picked up. When the sun rose, the fog had vanished, leaving the forest looking as serene as ever. But something about it felt wrong, like the woods were hiding a secret just beneath the surface. I packed up camp quickly, eager to get out of there. As I was finishing, I noticed something at the edge of the clearing. Footprints. Long, deep imprints in the ground. Far too large and spaced too widely to be human. They trailed along the boundary of the clearing, stopping just short of where I had slept. I didn't wait around to inspect them. I slung my pack over my shoulder and hiked out of there as fast as I could, refusing to look back. It took me the entire day to get back to the car, and by the time I reached it, the sun was beginning to set again. As I drove away, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But that night, when I finally crawled into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The next morning, I found dirt and leaves tracked into my house, large uneven footprints leading from my front door to the bedroom window. I haven't been camping since. I've camped plenty of times before, but Coldwater Canyon was supposed to be different, more remote, wilder. Mia and I wanted an escape from everything, a place where the world couldn't reach us. No phones, no stress, no noise. The online reviews were sparse, but the ones we found all described it as breathtakingly beautiful, isolated, peaceful. We never saw that side of it. The first red flag should have been the town, a little place called Fenlo, about an hour's drive from the canyon. When we stopped for supplies, the locals stared at us like we didn't belong, their eyes narrowing as we pulled into the gas station. It was unnerving. An older man behind the counter glanced at our camping gear and shook his head. He didn't say anything at first, just scanned the items with a slow, deliberate movement before he finally spoke, in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "You going up to Coldwater?" he asked. Mia smiled, oblivious. "Yeah, we've been planning this trip for weeks." The man's face darkened. "Don't stay there after dark," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "Things ain't right up there." We laughed it off in the car, calling him a superstitious old man. Every small town has its myths, we figured. But there was something in the way he said it, something that stuck with me as we drove the long, winding road deeper into the mountains. The trees grew thicker, the air cooler. Soon, the road narrowed to a dirt path, and Coldwater Canyon welcomed us with towering cliffs and a thick forest that seemed to swallow the light. We set up camp in a clearing by the creek, the air crisp and clean. The sound of rushing water was soothing, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Mia was in her element, laughing as we gathered wood for the fire and talked about the long hike we'd planned for the next day. It felt like we were the only two people left in the world. As the sun began to set, a strange unease crept over me. It started with small things. The way the wind moved through the trees, it had a low, mournful quality, almost like a voice whispering in the distance. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the silence between the wind gusts felt heavy, pressing in on us. I didn't say anything to Mia. I didn't want to spoil the mood. The first night passed without incident, though I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a faint rustling just outside the tent. Not like an animal. It was too slow, too deliberate. Mia was out cold, oblivious to my growing anxiety, and by morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just nerves. We spent the day hiking up to the ridge, the view from the top stunning, almost enough to push the previous night's worries from my mind. Almost. But something about the forest below felt wrong. The trees, so densely packed together, seemed to move, shift in ways they shouldn't. It was like the forest was watching us. When I mentioned it to Mia, she laughed and said I was being paranoid. That night things got worse. It started around midnight. We were sitting by the fire, watching the flames crackle and pop when Mia froze, staring into the woods. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I hadn't, not at first. But when I listened closely, there it was, a faint tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It was rhythmic, coming from deep within the forest, and it grew louder, closer, with each tap. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the trees, but there was nothing. Just the dense, impenetrable wall of pine and shadow. Tap, tap, tap. The sound stopped. The forest was silent, except for the crackling fire and the soft trickle of the creek nearby. Mia was on edge now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there just beyond the light watching us. Then, out of nowhere, Mia gasped. She pointed toward the edge of the clearing, her hand trembling. I followed her gaze and saw it. Eyes. Reflective, unblinking eyes staring at us from the tree line. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote. But these eyes were wrong. They were too high off the ground, too wide apart, and they didn't move, didn't blink. Just stared. We both stood frozen, the fire casting flickering shadows across the clearing, but the eyes didn't flinch. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed away, pulling Mia with me toward the tent. I didn't dare look away from the tree line, but as we retreated, the eyes remained fixed on us, glowing faintly in the firelight. We zipped ourselves into the tent, our breaths shallow, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. I whispered to Mia that it was probably just an animal, trying to convince her as much as myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It was something else. The tapping resumed, It was closer now, just outside the tent, circling us. Tap, tap, tap. Each knock was measured, deliberate, as if something or someone was toying with us. Mia gripped my hand so tightly it hurt, but I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. Then came the scratching. Soft at first, like nails dragging across the nylon fabric of the tent. It moved slowly, methodically, tracing the edges of the tent. Mia's eyes were wide, tears pooling in the corners, but we were both too terrified to move. The scratching stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't know. Time seemed to stretch on forever, and we stayed frozen in place, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. It never came. By dawn, the forest seemed normal again. The birds were chirping, the wind had returned, and the sun filtered through the trees like everything was fine. But the unease lingered. Neither of us talked about what had happened. We didn't need to. We both knew something was wrong with Coldwater Canyon. We packed up in silence, ready to leave as quickly as possible. But as we began the hike back toward the car, we noticed something strange. The trail, the one we had followed in so easily, was different. It wound in directions we didn't recognize, twisting through unfamiliar parts of the forest. Landmarks we had passed the day before were missing, as if the forest had shifted in the night. Panic set in quickly. We hiked for hours, but no matter which way we went, we couldn't find the trailhead. The sun was high in the sky, but the deeper we went into the woods, the darker it seemed to get, the trees growing thicker and more oppressive. And then we saw it. Carved into the trunks of several trees were symbols, strange angular shapes like runes. They were old, weathered, but clearly deliberate, and the further we walked, the more we saw, scattered throughout the forest, marking the trees like a warning. The tapping returned. It was closer this time, echoing through the woods, coming from every direction. Mia and I spun around, our eyes wide with fear, but there was no one there. Nothing. Just the trees, the symbols, and the sound. And then we saw the eyes again, dozens of them, lurking in the shadows between the trees, glowing faintly in the dim light. They watched us, unblinking, unrelenting. This time there was no doubt. They weren't animals. They were waiting. We ran. Branches tore at our clothes, our skin, but we didn't care. We just ran, our breath ragged, our hearts pounding in our chests. The eyes followed, keeping pace with us, always just out of sight, just beyond the next tree. By some miracle, we stumbled onto the road. I don't remember how we got there, but we didn't stop. We ran until we saw the car, threw our gear inside, and sped out of Coldwater Canyon, never looking back. We didn't speak for the entire drive back, but I knew Mia felt it too. The lingering presence, the sense that we had barely escaped something ancient, something wrong. I still see the eyes sometimes in my dreams, staring at me from the shadows, waiting. I'll never forget that night. The night the dark woods showed me something I can't explain, something I still don't want to believe. It started as a typical camping trip, just me and 3 friends, Josh, Tyler, and Emily, out in the middle of nowhere, deep in the heart of the Black Ridge Forest. We'd heard it was isolated, quiet, the perfect escape from the noise of the city. But that same isolation would soon turn into a nightmare. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the thick canopy of trees. It was beautiful, at first. The air smelled of pine and earth, the kind of crisp, clean scent that made you feel alive. But as the sun started to dip behind the mountains, the forest seemed to change. It was subtle at first, just a strange quiet, as if the birds and insects had suddenly stopped. Josh laughed it off. "Come on, it's just the woods. Relax. We're probably the only people out here for miles." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And then, right before nightfall, the park ranger showed up. He was an older man, grizzled with deep-set eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. He wore the typical ranger's uniform, but something about him felt off. He didn't smile, didn't even really look at us when he spoke, just stared into the trees like he was searching for something. "You folks camping here tonight?" His voice was gravelly, rough. "Might want to reconsider." Tyler, always the skeptic, chuckled. "Why's that? Bears? Wolves?" The ranger shook his head slowly. "Not exactly." He stepped closer to our fire, his eyes still scanning the tree line. "You ever heard of skinwalkers?" None of us said anything. I'd heard the stories, sure, but I thought they were just legends, creepy tales passed around campfires to scare kids. The ranger continued. "Local legend says these woods are cursed. Things out here, they're not what they seem. You see something, someone that doesn't belong. You turn the other way. Don't engage. Don't follow. Most importantly, don't listen." Emily, trying to lighten the mood, rolled her eyes. "Okay, Ranger, we'll be sure to watch out for any creepy creatures in the dark." But the ranger didn't laugh. He just looked at us, long and hard, before turning back toward the woods. "You've been warned." With that, he disappeared into the trees, leaving us in an uncomfortable silence. The sun had fully set by now, and the only light came from our campfire, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. We laughed it off, at first, tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled over us. But as the night went on, things started to happen. It began with the sounds. At first it was just the wind, or at least that's what I told myself. But then came the rustling, just beyond the reach of the firelight, like something was circling us, staying hidden just out of sight. Josh stood up, grabbing his flashlight, probably just a raccoon or something. He aimed the beam into the trees, but there was nothing there, just darkness, the kind of darkness that swallows light whole. "I don't like this," Emily whispered. "It's too quiet." She was right. The forest had gone deathly still, no crickets, no owls, nothing. Just that oppressive silence, like the trees were holding their breath. Suddenly there was a crack, a branch snapping in the distance. Josh swung his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but again there was nothing. Or so I thought. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the shadows. It looked human, tall, thin, but something was wrong. Its proportions were off. Its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Is that someone?" Tyler muttered, squinting into the darkness. But before we could answer, the figure moved, fast, too fast. It disappeared behind a tree, and I swear, the sound of its footsteps. It wasn't right. It was like clicking, bones snapping. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. But Josh, always the brave one, scoffed. "It's probably just some weirdo. Come on, don't let the ranger's ghost stories freak you out." That's when we heard it, a voice, faint, distant, coming from the trees. "Help. Me." It sounded like a woman, soft, weak. Emily gasped. "Did you hear that? Someone's out there." "No," I whispered. "No one's out there." "Help. Me." The voice called again, closer this time. But there was something off about it, like it was trying too hard to sound human. Josh pointed his flashlight into the trees, but the beam flickered and died. "Damn batteries." The voice came again, louder. "Please, help me." Emily stood up, panic in her eyes. "We can't just leave someone out there." "No." I grabbed her arm. "The ranger, he warned us. That's not a person." "What are you talking about?" she snapped. "We can't just—" Then the voice changed. It was subtle, but enough to send a chill down my spine. It wasn't pleading anymore. It was mocking. "Help, me." It was laughing. And then it stepped out of the trees. The figure, But it wasn't just one. There were two now. They moved in unison, like their limbs were connected by invisible strings, their heads twitching at odd angles. The firelight barely touched them, but I could see their eyes, glowing, reflecting the flames like animal eyes in the dark. Emily screamed. Josh backed up, stumbling over a log. "What the hell is that?" And then they spoke. In our voices. "Help me, please, don't leave me." They were copying us, mimicking. Tyler grabbed his pack. "We need to go now." We ran. I don't know how long we sprinted through the woods, but it felt like hours. The sounds behind us, that awful clicking, the snapping of branches, it was everywhere, surrounding us. When we finally stopped, out of breath and terrified, we realized something horrible. We were back at our campsite. The fire was still burning, flickering weakly in the night, the same clearing, the same trees, as if we'd never left. And then we saw ourselves, sitting by the fire, 4 figures, hunched over, motionless, their backs to us, wearing our clothes, our faces. But they weren't us. Their skin was too tight, too pale, stretched over their bones like they didn't quite fit. And then one of them turned. It smiled. That's when I blacked out. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was alone. The campsite was empty, no sign of Josh, Tyler, or Emily, just the cold, empty forest. And in the distance, I swear I heard it. A voice. My voice, asking for help. I haven't seen my friends since. And sometimes late at night, I hear them, hear me, calling from the woods. But I know better than to answer. I've always been a rational person. You know the type. Grounded, logical, a firm believer in things that can be seen, touched, and explained. So when my girlfriend Claire suggested we take a weekend camping trip to an old, nearly abandoned state park, I didn't think twice. I loved the idea of getting away, deep into the woods, just the two of us. Little did I know, those woods had something waiting for us, something I can't explain. The park was tucked away, miles off any major road. It used to be popular decades ago, but the state rerouted the main highway and the place slowly withered away. Only the diehard campers or locals went there anymore. That sounded perfect to me. No noisy crowds, just nature and quiet. We arrived mid-afternoon, parking our car at the small gravel lot near the ranger station. The building was old, weathered, with no one inside. A faded map of the park was pinned to a bulletin board, but most of the trails were overgrown or unmarked. Claire was excited, and I could feel that sense of adventure kicking in. We grabbed our gear and set off down one of the more accessible trails, winding through the thick forest. The trees were massive, their branches intertwined so densely that the sunlight barely filtered through. It was eerie but beautiful, and the isolation was exactly what we'd been looking for. After hiking for a couple of hours, we found a spot near a creek, a small clearing just big enough for our tent. We set up camp, the sound of the flowing water calming and constant. As the sun sank lower, casting the forest in hues of gold and shadow, I gathered wood for a fire, while Claire laid out some snacks. Everything was going perfectly. Too perfectly. The first sign that something was off came as night fell. The fire was crackling, the air was cool but comfortable, and we were just talking about random things. Life, work, future plans. That's when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint, almost like a stick tapping against a tree. I thought it was just the wind at first, but then it came again, 3 slow taps. Silence. Then 3 more. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice low. I nodded, looking around. The forest, once filled with the sounds of birds and insects, had gone dead silent. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just the tapping. "Maybe it's a woodpecker," I offered, trying to keep the mood light, though something in my gut felt wrong. Woodpeckers don't tap like that. The tapping continued, steady, methodical, as if it was coming from all around us. Claire stood looking into the trees, her face pale in the firelight. "That's not an animal," she whispered. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the woods. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, revealing only more trees, gnarled and ancient. No movement, no animals, nothing. The tapping stopped, just like that. I sighed in relief, chuckling nervously. See? Probably nothing. But Claire didn't laugh. Her eyes were fixed on something just beyond the firelight. I followed her gaze, shining the flashlight over, but saw nothing unusual. "What is it?" I asked. I thought I saw something," she murmured. "Something big." I scoffed, though my skin prickled. "Big? Like a deer?" She shook her head. "No, taller, much taller." I wanted to dismiss it. My rational brain kicked in, reminding me that people often see shapes in the shadows, especially in the woods at night. It's just tricks of the light, our minds playing games with us. But something in Claire's voice made me feel uneasy. She wasn't the type to scare easily. I tried to change the subject, suggesting we eat, maybe have a drink, but Claire stayed uneasy, her eyes darting to the trees every few seconds. The fire seemed to shrink, even as I fed it more wood, as if the darkness was pressing closer. That's when we heard it again, the tapping. But this time it was louder, closer, and there was something else. A voice, faint, almost like a whisper carried on the breeze. "Claire?" We both froze. The voice was soft, distant, but unmistakably calling her name. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her hand gripping my arm tightly. I nodded, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Yeah, I did." "Who's out there?" I yelled into the darkness, trying to sound braver than I felt. But no one answered. The tapping stopped, replaced by a stillness that was even more unsettling. "Let's just pack up and go," Claire said suddenly, her voice trembling. "I don't want to stay here anymore." I nodded in agreement. The uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me was now a full-blown alarm. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it was. We started packing quickly, but as we did, something moved in the trees. A shadow, tall and gangly, just at the edge of our vision. I turned my flashlight toward it, but it vanished behind the trees. Too fast, too quiet. "Did you see that?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. My heart was pounding, and all I could think about was getting out of there. We grabbed our gear, leaving the fire burning, and started down the trail, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. As we walked, the forest around us seemed to change. The trees felt closer, their branches twisting overhead like claws reaching for us. The air grew colder, heavier, and the silence was oppressive. Every step felt like we were being watched. And then we heard it again. The tapping. It was louder now, echoing through the trees, and the voice came with it, closer, clearer. "Claire, come back." Claire squeezed my hand, her breathing shallow, her eyes wide with fear. "Who the hell is that?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The voice, it sounded wrong, too flat, too hollow, like someone trying to imitate a person, but not quite getting it right. We quickened our pace, practically running down the trail, but the tapping followed us, growing louder and faster, keeping pace with us. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. Something tall, impossibly tall, moving through the trees. It didn't walk. It glided, silent and smooth, its limbs too long, its body too thin. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Claire's arm, and we bolted down the trail, the tapping now a frantic beat behind us like a drum echoing in the night. We didn't stop running until we burst out of the trees and into the parking lot. panting and drenched in sweat. The tapping had stopped, but the silence remained, thick and unnatural. I fumbled with the car keys, throwing our gear into the trunk as quickly as possible. Claire was already in the passenger seat, her face pale, her hands shaking. I started the car and we peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind us. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woods were dark, impenetrable. But just at the edge of the trees, standing perfectly still, was a figure. Tall, thin, watching us. I haven't been camping since that night. I haven't told anyone else about what we saw. Claire won't talk about it either, but sometimes late at night when the world is quiet and dark, I can still hear it. The tapping, steady, rhythmic. And sometimes just on the edge of sleep I hear the voice calling my name. It was supposed to be a simple solo camping trip. I've done this kind of thing 100 times before, just me, my gear, and the woods. I'd found a secluded spot online, tucked deep into the heart of an old-growth forest. The site wasn't listed on any official maps, but some obscure forum posts said it was a prime location for experienced campers. Hard to reach, but worth it for the solitude. I liked the sound of that, so I packed up for the weekend and headed out early Friday morning. The first part of the hike was uneventful, just hours of navigating trails that grew narrower and more overgrown as I went. By late afternoon, the underbrush had swallowed the path completely, and I was bushwhacking through dense trees. That's when I saw something strange. About a mile from where I planned to camp, there was an old, crumbling stone structure. It looked like the remains of a chimney, standing alone in the woods. No house, no foundation, just the stone rising out of the earth like a broken tooth. The chimney was covered in moss and vines, worn down by decades, maybe centuries. It gave me an eerie feeling, but I shrugged it off. Probably an old settler's cabin from a time long forgotten. I moved on, pushing deeper into the woods until I found a clearing. It was perfect, quiet, open, surrounded by tall, ancient trees. I set up my tent and started a fire, feeling the warmth of the flames push back the encroaching evening chill. The sky was a deep, velvety purple as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the stars began to dot the sky. This is what I came for. Peace. Solitude. But that night, I started hearing things. It wasn't animals. I know what wildlife sounds like. Raccoons scurrying through leaves, owls calling, the occasional coyote howling in the distance. This was different. It started as a low murmuring, like a conversation just out of earshot. At first, I thought it might be the wind moving through the trees, but there wasn't any breeze. The air was still, heavy even. The murmuring grew louder, but I couldn't make out any distinct words. It was like several people were talking at once, just beyond the reach of my firelight. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Just the impenetrable darkness of the forest beyond the glow of the fire. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just the sounds of the woods messing with my head. But the voices, or whatever they were, didn't stop. They circled the camp, growing louder, more insistent. It felt like they were pressing in on me from all sides, though there was nothing to see. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and pulled my sleeping bag over my head, trying to drown out the noise. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I woke up in the middle of the night to total silence. The murmuring had stopped. Relieved, I peeked out of my sleeping bag and glanced at the tent wall. But something was wrong. The light from the fire was gone. I should have been able to see the flickering orange glow through the thin nylon, but instead, it was pitch black. I unzipped the tent just enough to look outside. The fire had been completely smothered, as if someone had dumped a bucket of dirt over it. But the thing that sent a cold wave of fear through me wasn't the dead fire, it was the footprints. They were all around the camp, circling it like a pack of wolves. At first I thought they were human, but they weren't. They were too large, too misshapen. The prints were elongated, like human feet stretched and twisted into something unnatural. There were too many toes, too many claws. My heart hammered in my chest as I crouched there, staring at the imprints in the dirt. Something had been here, something not human. I closed the tent, locking myself inside like that thin layer of fabric would protect me from whatever was out there. The night passed slowly, every sound amplified by my fear. But nothing came. No more voices, no more footsteps. When dawn finally came, I packed up as fast as I could, eager to get out of that place. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, like eyes were on me from every shadowed corner of the woods. The entire hike back felt wrong, the silence too thick, the forest too still. It wasn't until I reached the main trailhead that I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But here's the thing, when I got home I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but strange things started happening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to hear that same murmuring, faint but unmistakable, coming from outside my window. One night, I found dirt and leaves scattered on my bedroom floor, like someone, or something, had walked straight through the walls. I checked my doors and windows. They were all locked. And then 2 nights ago I woke up to the sound of footsteps just outside my bedroom door. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, as I listened to the sound of something pacing in the hallway. I didn't dare open the door. No. In the morning there were footprints in the hall, the same twisted, elongated prints I'd seen in the campsite. I don't know what I brought back from the woods, but it's here now, and it's not going away. Whatever was out there, it followed me home, and it's getting closer.